Chapter 61. The dense mass of shadows leaped back and forth between the trees like giant apes. In a short moment, they were right in front of Howrin. One of the shadows descended from the sky and pounced on a soldier with a sword raised in his hand. Although the cavalrymen had already drawn their weapons, they seemed to be unprepared against such a tall enemy. Very quickly, 3 of them were knocked down. One of them had his heart pierced by a knife, while the other 2 were struggling with their opponents. Crack! As he struggled to get up, Kevin, who was beside him, had already used the pyramid to smash away a black shadow that was pouncing on him. There was a dagger in Kevin's shoulder. The dagger had pierced through the gap in his shoulder guard, and blood was dripping out. It seemed that he had been injured when he was pounced on. What the hell? What's that? He watched as the shadows retreated quickly. They jumped up and changed positions with a few hops. They were clearly burly figures, but they were as nimble as monkeys. Kevin gasped for breath and roared, "Close in! Everyone close in! These are Odin's Icelandic hunters!" In the first wave of attacks, 6 of the Byzantium cavalry scouts were already down. Only 2 were still alive. The other 4 were already dead. On the other hand, only 2 of the Icelandic hunters had died. Other than the one whose neck was broken by Shea, the other was smashed to death by Kevin's awl. The one who fell under a tree had a large dent in his chest. His sternum was shattered. In the darkness of the night, the sky was blocked by the branches and leaves. In order to hide, the scouts did not light a fire. However, with his night vision, Shea was still able to clearly see the appearance of these Icelandic hunters. These guys were all covered in black fur, and they were a head taller than the cavaliers of Byzantine. Their long arms were hanging down, and they looked like apes. Their tall bodies were covered in black fur, and they looked like bears. It was hard to see their faces in the dark. The strangest thing was that although these fellows were bulky, their movements were frighteningly nimble when they ran and jumped. Even when they jumped between the trees or on the ground, they did not make a single sound. After all, they were the elite 13th Cavalry Division. The scouts quickly gathered together and formed a circle with their backs against each other. Shea and Kevin were close to each other. Next to them was the captain of the scouts. The captain's face was covered with blood. He had been thrown to the ground just now and his forehead was bruised. He was holding his sword with one hand and clutching his left rib with the other. The leather armor there had been cut open and blood was gushing out of a deep wound. "It's these damn things. Humph! They are the archenemies of our Byzantium scouts." The scouts' captain gasped for breath. He stared at the hunters in the darkness. Those fellows had retreated after a single strike. But they were not far away. More than 10 figures were moving back and forth on the trees, looking for an opportunity to attack. These guys are Odin's scouts. They live in Odin's northern icefield region and survive on the smooth icefield and steep snowy mountain cliffs all year round. Their skills are the most agile. Kevin forcefully pulled out the dagger from his shoulder and furrowed his brows in pain as he gritted his teeth and said, "Shea, be careful. These guys are Odin's scouts." No wonder. Each one of them were like apes. Shea squinted his eyes and stared into the distance. Both sides were patiently facing each other. Those Icelandic hunters were constantly changing their positions. Finally, a whistle was heard. A black shadow took the lead and jumped down. More than 10 shadows jumped down from all directions. The cavalrymen raised their swords to block. However, those fellows were extremely ferocious. Even though the cavalrymen's swords had clearly struck the other party did not seem to care. The other party would stick up and stab the cavalrymen's vital points with their daggers. After a few cries of pain, the defensive circle was broken. Shea kicked one of the fellows pouncing towards him. His strength was great. That kick caused the man to vomit blood while he was still in the air. Country Bumpkin had already pulled out his flaming fork. He could see that against these fellows, using a large cross-shaped double-edged sword would not be convenient. Instead, it would affect his agility. Then, Shea rushed forward. He jumped up with all his might. Just like the Icelandic hunters, he jumped up several meters and met one of the fellows in the air. Shea opened his arms and hugged the other party like an octopus. That fellow's dagger had already pierced into Shea's chest. However, that fellow had miscalculated. Country Bumpkin's current level of toughness was not something that a dagger could pierce through. Shea exerted all his strength to tighten his arms. With a few cracking sounds, he crushed the other party's bones. The strength of a barbarian was no small matter. Shea carried the fellow who was vomiting blood and landed on a tree. He tossed the corpse aside and took the dagger from the other party's hand. Seeing a shadow pouncing towards him from the side, Shea threw the dagger with all his might. That fellow immediately used both hands to cover his throat. He cried out a few times and fell backward. Shea seemed to have transformed into an Icelandic hunter. His movements, the speed of his leap and the degree of his agility were far above the other party. If the other party was an ape, then Chun Xiaolian was simply a leopard cat. After killing 3 of them in one breath, he quickly aimed for the next target. This was the tallest guy. That guy had already used his dagger to cut the neck of a cavalry scout. His face was full of blood. When he rolled up from the ground, Shea had already rushed over and pulled his body down again. The 2 men struggled on the ground. Shea immediately felt that the other party's strength was not small. He was much stronger than the Icelandic hunters he had dealt with before. He tried to twist the other party's neck, but this guy actually struggled to break his hand. Shea did not want to do it. This uncle wants to kill you and you dare to resist? The 2 men rolled on the ground. Shea made a little space. He bent his knee and heavily hit the other party's thigh. That guy was in pain and his body was twisted. Shea took the opportunity to let go of his arm and hit the other party's heart with his elbow. With a few cracking sounds, his sternum burst open. Shea quickly jumped up and like a leopard, scurried up a tree. At first glance, he saw that Kevin had knocked down an opponent, but another Icefield hunter had pounced on Kevin's back from behind. That guy's legs were tightly wrapped around Kevin's waist. The rash guy struggled a few times but was unable to get rid of him. The Icelandic hunter on his back was holding a dagger and fiercely stabbing Kevin's neck. Shea did not hesitate. The fire fork in his hand was thrown out like lightning. Kevin had already felt the cold air on his neck. His heart was in despair. Suddenly, he heard a puff sound. Blood spilled on his ear. The Icelandic hunter's body stiffened and fell down. Turning around, the Icelandic hunter's head was directly pierced by the fire fork. Shea jumped down and pulled out the fire fork. Kevin gasped for breath and whispered, "I owe you a life." The corners of Shea's mouth twitched at this moment. Only 4 of the Byzantium cavalry scouts were still alive. The Icelandic hunters finally whistled and jumped out of the battle circle. They quickly jumped onto the trees. Several shadows no longer lingered in the battle and hurriedly jumped out of the darkness. 14 of the Byzantium cavalry scouts died in this sneak attack. The death toll of the Icelandic hunters was 10. Among them, Shea and Kevin had killed 6. One could imagine that without Kevin and Shea, this group of Byzantium cavalry scouts would have been wiped out. For the first time, Shea had a deep impression of Odin's valiance. The enemies were far away. Kevin immediately sat down on the ground. Some of the scouts could not stand steadily. The captain was still alive. He stretched out his hand to support himself against a tree. The wound under his ribs had already dyed half of his body red. Kevin looked at Shea's strange expression. He pulled him and whispered, "Odin's people are originally savage. These Icelandic hunters are natural scouts among Odin's people. Although they are enemies, but in terms of individual combat strength, they are stronger than us Byzantium." After a pause, Kevin added, "But the general said that when these guys gather together, they are a motley crew. We can always defeat them." In just a moment of fighting, 14 of their companions who ate and slept together for several days turned into cold corpses. For these cavalry soldiers, they did not appear to be too sad. They only quietly cleaned up the battlefield and moved the corpses of their companions together. At the same time, they carefully inspected the enemies. Those who were still alive, they did not hesitate to stab them with their swords. The process was very silent. No one said a word. For these people, it was as if they were used to this kind of life and death parting on the battlefield. No one's face showed any grief. Only grief turned into hatred, flashing in their eyes. The wounded captain stood in front of a corpse and looked at it for a while. It was the first soldier who was shot in the neck during the sneak attack. When he fell from the tree, his neck and his water bag were nailed together by a sharp arrow. The water in the water bag had already flowed out and mixed with his blood. The captain silently looked at the young soldier. For a moment, his eyes seemed to be filled with a deathly stillness. Then he turned his head and said in a hoarse voice, "There is no time to delay. We have discovered the enemy. We must immediately bring the news back. Everyone, get on your horses and set off immediately." The captain took the lead and quickly climbed onto his horse. The rest of the cavalry followed behind him and quickly left this forest filled with killing. Only after running for more than 10 li did Kevin whisper to Shea, "That dead soldier is the captain's son." Shea was stunned. This dead young cavalry soldier didn't leave a deep impression on Shea during these days of interaction. He only remembered that he had a simple face and firm eyes. Only when he smiled would he reveal a bit of shyness. And during these days, when he faced the captain, he would call him captain like everyone else. He had never called him father. He also didn't receive any preferential treatment from the captain. Scouting, vigilance, and night watch were all left to him. In just a moment, a father had sent his son away. In just a moment, life and death had cruelly separated family. This was the first battle that Shea had experienced in the army. When the captain looked at his dead son, his eyes were as lonely as death. It was like a knife that was deeply carved into Shea's heart. For the young hunter, he was suddenly reminded of a fact by this small-scale but tragic battle in front of him. War wasn't like hunting in the forest. War wasn't like adventuring in the wildfire plains. War was war. Chapter 62. When the remnants of the cavalry scouts returned to the 13th Cavalry Division's encampment, everyone's face relaxed slightly. The military intelligence brought back was naturally submitted by the leader of the scouts according to military regulations, while Shea was brought back to the personal guards by Kevin. Looking at the scouts who had fought side by side with him silently returning to the camp, Shea's heart suddenly felt suffocated. These 2 days of hurrying back, on the way back, everyone had hardly spoken. An invisible fire burned fiercely in Shea's heart, and the more it burned, the more intense it became. Looking at the cavalry scouts leaving, Shea looked at the back of the leader. He suddenly felt that he was very lucky. At least the old man died in bed, and he could bury him with his own hands. And this leader's son, in order to rush back, they didn't even have time to bury the body. Shea and Kevin didn't get any time to rest. They had just returned to the tent after reporting to the personal guards. The two of them didn't have time to unbuckle their armor belts when someone from outside came to pass on a message. "General wants to see them now." When Shea came to General Adric's tent for the second time, he immediately felt that the atmosphere was different. At the entrance of the tent, the personal guards on duty had doubled, and everyone's face was filled with a pre-battle nervousness. While waiting for the announcement, Shea and Kevin stood outside the tent. From afar, they could hear angry shouts coming from the tent, followed by a fierce argument. A moment later, several high-ranking officers walked out of the large tent. Shea recognized one of them as the silver-haired middle-aged man whom he had seen last time, the flag-bearer of the 3rd Emblem Group, Butler. The others were presumably high-ranking officers of the Emblem Groups under the 13th Cavalry Division. When 7 to 8 people strode out, everyone had different expressions. Some looked worried, some didn't care, and some had eyes that were spitting fire. When they walked over, Kevin immediately pulled Shea back, and the two of them retreated, thumping their chests and bowing. After these people had left, Kevin looked at the puzzled expression on Shea's face and said, "It must be the pre-battle meeting. The emblem groups below are fighting over who will be the vanguard. This is a common occurrence. Judging from flag-bearer Butler's expression, the opportunity to be the vanguard has probably fallen into his hands." The map on the wall of the tent had been painted in a variety of colors. Some densely packed military symbols were marked in various regions, and these symbols were painted in different colors. When Shea saw this map that seemed to have changed beyond recognition, he suddenly froze and subconsciously took a few more glances at it. This seems to be the symbol of a military map. Shea remembered that there was a book in the old man's collection that specifically talked about these things. When he was young, he found it amusing. He even took a map of the wildfire plains and doodled for a while. Yes, the square symbol represents the base, the round symbol represents the logistics facilities, and the dotted line represents the logistics transportation line. The triangles represented the heights of the hills, while the ellipses represented low-lying areas. Some areas on the map were painted with small green flags, indicating the safe areas that had been searched. Some places with small crosses indicated that there had been small-scale skirmishes with the enemy. Shea couldn't help but be lost in thought. It wasn't until Kevin beside him pulled him that he came back to his senses. Shea raised his head and saw General Adric sizing him up with a gaze full of interest. This domineering general's face was flushed, and his forehead was slightly sweaty. He held a small dagger with a golden hilt in his hand and was casually cutting a thick piece of paper into pieces. He looked at Shea, but his hands didn't stop moving. After observing for a long time, to the point where Shea felt his scalp tingle, General Adric finally retracted his frightening gaze. "You can understand the military symbols on this map?" Adric caught Shea's expression when he first came in. Shea hesitated for a moment. "I know a few." Kevin turned his head to look at Shea curiously. Shea took a deep breath. "I've read about this in some books." "Very good." Adric nodded. He picked up a charcoal pencil in front of him and tossed it to Shea. "Mark the location on the map where you encountered Odin's men for me to see." Shea took the charcoal pencil and didn't hesitate. He walked to the side of the map and accurately found the location. Then, he drew a small cross on the map. After thinking for a moment, he marked a small circle next to it. The last action made Adric reveal a look of satisfaction. The last symbol that Shea drew represented the front line of the enemy's search party in the Byzantine army. "It seems you really do know these things." Adric smiled. He retracted his gaze and nailed the dagger in his hand to the table. His face turned serious. "I know the result of your operation. You did well." He stared at Shea. "You killed 6 Odin's Icefield hunters alone?" "5. Shea thought for a moment and said calmly, "I killed 5 of them, and I injured the last one. It was Kevin who killed him." The general nodded. He stood up and walked around the table to stand before Shea. This domineering general had a tall and sturdy figure. When he stood before Shea, Shea felt that he wasn't standing before a person, but a lion king. Adric's eyes shone as he looked at Shea. "Raise your head and stand properly." Next, he placed his rough military hand on Shea's shoulder and placed a badge on Shea's chest. "This is your military rank." His tone was very serious. "Originally, you should have been a private. However, in view of your outstanding performance in this mission, killing 5 Odin's men, according to the imperial military law, I will promote you to the rank of sergeant." The badge was a piece of slightly protruding black iron. Originally, Shea did not care too much about it. However, when he saw the black iron, he was suddenly reminded of the scout captain. His dead son was wearing this type of badge. "I hope you understand. Here, this badge represents glory, blood, and sacrifice." Adric's voice was very dignified. Additionally, you have killed 5 enemies. According to the imperial military law, you will be awarded a black iron medal of courage. The military law office will report this and it will be sent to you soon. After saying that, he suddenly turned to look at Kevin. Kevin, how long after you joined the army did you receive your first medal of courage? Kevin appeared troubled. He scratched his head and smiled wryly. I can't remember. However, it should be 1 year later. Ha! It seems this new kid is stronger than you. After saying that, Adrik walked back to the table. Kevin, bring this kid to get his new warhorse. Also, from today onwards, equip the personal guards with cavalry equipment. Kevin's eyes immediately lit up. General, are we going to attack? Adrik glanced at Kevin with a smile that was not a smile. Kevin immediately understood and excitedly thumped his chest. He pulled the dazed Shea and ran away. After leaving the tent, Shea remembered to ask Kevin about the Medal of Courage. According to Kevin's explanation, if an ordinary soldier in the Imperial Army could kill more than 5 enemies on the battlefield, they would be awarded a Medal of Courage. This medal would also become the capital for future promotions. The Black Iron Medal of Courage was only awarded to ordinary soldiers without a military rank. Once promoted to an officer, they would no longer be able to receive this medal. Apart from that, the Black Iron Medal of Courage had a special benefit. Any veteran who received this medal would be exempt from paying all imperial taxes for the rest of their lives. When Shea heard this, he did not think much of it. He originally lived in Wildfire Town and was not a citizen of the Byzantine Empire. He had never paid taxes to the Byzantine Empire. Kevin pulled Shea back to the tent. This bald man seemed very excited. The reason for his excitement was very simple. Personal guards are rarely equipped with cavalry equipment. Since the general has given this order, it's clear that we have a big battle ahead of us. After pausing for a moment, he smiled and said, "All right, I'll bring you to get your warhorse now. You don't have to torture my horse anymore." After experiencing a battle, Kevin's attitude towards Shea had become much more intimate. It was clear that he had already begun to accept Shea as his comrade. You've become a soldier, so you're considered a regular soldier. Normally, in the army, private soldiers can only serve as auxiliary soldiers. Only regular soldiers can serve as real fighters. We are a cavalry unit, and the requirements to become a regular soldier are much stricter than an infantry regiment. You can now receive 2 warhorses. These 2 warhorses will be your mounts, and at the same time, your cavalry equipment, armor, shield, pike. At this point, Kevin suddenly stopped in his tracks and slapped his head. I almost forgot an important thing. What is it? Shea was somewhat puzzled. Your squire. Kevin smiled. You are now an official cavalryman. Every official cavalryman will be accompanied by a squire. As the personal guards of the general, we have a special treatment. We can have a squire assigned to each of us. In the lower emblem groups, a few cavalrymen will share a squire. Squire? What's that for? Shea obviously had limited understanding of such details in the army. Kevin frowned. You can even understand a military map, but you don't know this? He patiently explained, Look at me, I'm now a cavalry captain. I have 3 warhorses, 2 sets of standing equipment, weapons, shields, and uniforms. Since that's the case, someone has to take care of my warhorses, feed them, wash them, and wipe my armor and weapons. Someone has to do all these chores, right? Of course, I can't do all these myself. Otherwise, just taking care of 3 warhorses would leave me with nothing else to do every day. He paused and smiled. A squire is your follower. You're in charge of fighting. Leave everything else to the squire. If you're injured, the squire has to take care of you. As he spoke, he patted Shea and walked forward. As he walked, he said loudly, Let's go, I'll bring you to the civilian camp to choose a suitable candidate. Let me make it clear, according to the traditions of the Byzantine army, The expenses of a cavalry squire need to be paid by you. In any case, your salary isn't low. You can afford to hire a retainer. At this point, Shea suddenly remembered something important. He strode forward to catch up with Kevin. Hey, how much is my salary now? Where can I get it? Chapter 63. For a troop class like cavalry, it was the most expensive and delicate troop class. According to the current standards of the Byzantine Empire, the cost of a cavalry unit was at least 7 times that of an infantry unit. If it was a light infantry unit, the difference would be 10 times. Firstly, as a cavalry unit, a soldier's individual qualities were far superior to an infantry unit. A skilled cavalry unit had to be proficient in horsemanship and fighting on horseback. A skilled cavalry unit was always more expensive than cheap labor. This principle was the same everywhere in the world. Secondly, a cavalry unit's equipment was much more expensive than an infantry unit's equipment. In any case, a 4-meter-long lance would consume more iron than a meter-long double-edged sword. Then there was the matter of horses. The fodder consumed by a high-quality warhorse was even more expensive than the food consumed by an ordinary infantryman. After all, an ordinary infantry unit could only eat coarse rations to fill their stomach. But for a warhorse, if the food it ate wasn't good enough, it wouldn't have the strength to run and its ability to carry weight would be reduced. This would seriously affect its fighting ability. Finally, there was the matter of retainers. Retainers were an essential part of a cavalry unit. For a qualified cavalryman, most of his time would be spent on horsemanship training, practicing combat skills such as assassination on horseback, acting out formations, and so on. Under such circumstances, one could not expect a cavalryman to take care of the horses, clean and repair damaged weapons, and so on every day. In the Byzantine Empire's strict hierarchy system, retainers were an essential part of a cavalry unit. The status of a retainer was even higher than that of an ordinary auxiliary soldier. Generally speaking, they had to be good at taking care of horses and repairing weapons and equipment. Higher-ranked retainers had to know some basic horsemanship. There were even cases where a retainer would equip a horse with weapons and equipment to assist the cavalry in battle. Shea was a special case because he had considerable fighting ability. If he was only an ordinary person, he definitely wouldn't have the opportunity to become a regular soldier. A large portion of cavalry units started as the most basic auxiliary soldiers. There were also some who were retainers and promoted to cavalry units after a period of time. About 2 li south of the 13th Cavalry Unit's encampment was the auxiliary camp. Stationed here were the auxiliary soldiers of the 13th Cavalry Unit. There were infantry units, auxiliary soldiers, logistical units, military supplies, civilian units, etc. Quite a number of them were temporarily conscripted before every war. The civilian camp was the camp closest to the edge. When he walked in, he saw teams of able-bodied men working hard. They were carrying bags of rations, bundles of arrows, and long wooden boxes carrying swords, weapons, and so on. Every single one of these workers had a grave expression on their faces. Beside them, there were also Byzantium soldiers with their hands on the hilts of their swords, watching them with cold eyes. It was conceivable that a considerable number of these civilian workers were not conscripted out of their own free will. This was a common occurrence in the army. Even if they were conscripted voluntarily, it was inevitable that some of them would run away due to panic when war came. These commoners were all covered in dirt and were wearing dirty robes. After Shea followed Kevin here, Kevin immediately found a fat officer from the military supply department. It could be seen that Kevin and this fat officer were old acquaintances. Facing the general's personal guard, this fat officer displayed an obvious fawning attitude. However, Kevin's attitude towards him was cold and disdainful. His words carried an unconcealable disgust. The fat officer was surprisingly thick-skinned. He completely ignored the disdain on Kevin's face, and the respectful smile on his face didn't diminish at all. When he heard Kevin's intention, he immediately smiled and said, "So you're here to pick your retainers? Don't worry, we've just recruited a group of good fellows. Some of them are good at blacksmithing, and some of them have reared horses. They'll all make good retainers. I will bring you to select them." Kevin was a little dissatisfied. How can a newly recruited civilian be a retainer? Can't we find suitable people in the auxiliary camp? The fat officer's face revealed a trace of embarrassment. The escort mission of the transport team is very heavy. The auxiliary camp's manpower is already very. Shea smiled and expressed his opinion at the right time. "It's fine. Commoners it is. I don't need a retainer to fight with me on the battlefield anyway. I just need someone who knows how to take care of the horses." Recalling Shea's powerful combat strength, Kevin was relieved. He reluctantly nodded and added, "It's best to find someone who knows a little about blacksmithing. Otherwise, it will be troublesome if the weapons are damaged." The fat officer walked in front to lead the way while Shea and Kevin followed behind. On the way, Shea couldn't help but ask in a low voice, "You seem to hate this guy a lot?" Kevin looked at Fatso's back and sneered in a low voice. "Humph, these people in the supply department are mostly a bunch of vermin and greedy rat. Our military resources, weapons, equipment, and even pay. Anything that passes through our hands, they will get their hands on it." Shea was a little surprised. "This kind of thing happens in the 13th Cavalry Division? Doesn't the general even ask about it?" Kevin looked at Shea and couldn't help but laugh. "It seems like you really need to learn the rules of the army." After a pause, he sighed. Although the supply department is attached to the army in name, it is not directly controlled by the combat troop. All of the supplies and logistics are self-contained and directly under the command of the Imperial Military Headquarters. Every independent regular army of the Empire, such as us, also has our own logistics and transportation camp. However, they are only responsible for transportation. During times of war, a special logistics camp will be set up in the war zone to be responsible for the unified supply of all troops. The standing supplies and rations in the army are usually only enough to last half a month. The logistics department needs to constantly replenish the supplies. The army will not let us hoard too many supplies." He lowered his voice. "This is the tradition of the Byzantine Empire's army. It is said that this system is to prevent the army from rebelling. An army that only has half a month's worth of supplies will have a hard time rebelling." Kevin looked at the back of the fat officer in front of him. The guy's fat but kept shaking as he walked. Kevin was a little annoyed. "Look at this guy. He's as fat as a pig. Who knows how much he embezzles on a daily basis?" But they belong to the logistics department of the war zone. The general can't effectively suppress them. He can only make an example out of them when he finds something to use against them. But the Empire's logistics system has always been rife with corruption. The current Minister of Logistics in the Imperial Military Headquarters, Count Moliak, is the most corrupt official in the Empire. Their biggest superiors are all corrupt officials, so naturally, the people below them will follow suit, layer by layer. Kevin sighed as he looked at Shea's thoughtful expression. "Don't be fooled by this guy's politeness. That's because we are the general's personal guards. Also, last month, the general seized an opportunity to kill a rat from the logistics department. We are the trump card of the Empire, and those fellows were intimidated by the general's might. That's why they didn't dare to act rashly. That's why their actions were slightly restrained." Shea didn't say anything. He recalled the contents of the old man's book. The separation of the logistics department and the command of the troops was indeed an effective way to prevent a general from having too much power. The book was right. But why did it still cause such a phenomenon? Don't tell me. The military law doesn't care about the embezzlement of military supplies? Shea couldn't help but ask. Count Moliak is the emperor's in-law. The military law doesn't dare to offend him. Even the most corrupt official doesn't dare to pursue the matter. Naturally, the people below him have nothing to fear. Kevin snorted and glanced at Shea. Don't talk about this anymore. You'll get into trouble. As expected, Kevin was right. While the fat officer appeared humble and respectful on the surface, when he did things, it felt like he was obeying on the surface but disobeying on the inside. He led Kevin and Shea to an encampment in the civilian camp and looked at the hundreds of civilian workers gathered in front of him. He didn't know where these guys were recruited from, but they were all covered in dirt, with numb eyes and empty and lifeless eyes. More importantly, there were old and young, and the only few guys who were in the prime of their lives looked stupid. Kevin immediately expressed his dissatisfaction and said angrily, "This is the suitable candidate you were talking about?" The fat officer smiled, but a strange look flashed in his eyes. "Of course. Don't be fooled by their stupid looks. They're honest enough. They definitely won't run away." "Bastard." Kevin raised an eyebrow, a murderous look on his face. "Are you messing with me? I want qualified retainers. How can these fellows be qualified? How can the cavalry's horses be taken care of by them? They're all farmers with experience in raising livestock. There shouldn't be a problem." The fat officer spread out his hands. "I've said it before. Right now we're short on manpower. I don't have much of a choice." Kevin was about to explode. Shea, who was beside him, was also infuriated. A country bumpkin's temper was not that good. He clenched his fists so tightly that cracking sounds could be heard. Once Kevin flared up, he would step forward and give this fat officer a good beating. At that moment, however, a miserable cry could be heard from the side. "Don't hit me! Don't hit me! I won't run away anymore." The miserable cry was accompanied by a sobbing tone. Turning toward the source of the sound, they saw a thin fellow wearing a tattered robe being kicked to the ground by two soldiers from the military supply department. One of the soldiers was holding a whip in his hand as he cursed. The whip landed on the fellow's body. The man on the ground had several holes in his robe. His hair was disheveled and his face dirty. He screamed with all his might. Using both hands, he desperately crawled forward. However, the whip continued to land on his back. The fellow suddenly caught sight of Shea, who was standing not too far away. His eyes suddenly burst with brilliance, and he mustered up all his strength to jump up. He quickly rushed forward and shouted, "Shea! Master Shea! It's me, it's me! Ouch! Save me, save me!" He had just finished shouting when he was kicked down by the soldiers behind him. He hugged himself and rolled on the ground. Shea was stunned for a moment. Then, he quickly ran over and pushed aside the two soldiers. He looked at the fellow on the ground. "It's you?" Shea stared with wide eyes. "It's me. It's me, it's me, Master Shea. I'm Todoro." The poor thin fellow's face was covered with tears and snot. It was the Mr. Magician that Shea sold to the poor thing for 1 gold coin. I don't know how he ended up in the civilian camp. Chapter 64. Todoro felt that he must have offended a supreme god, or been cursed. No way. Thinking back on himself, apart from swindling people who owed him money and being lustful and greedy, he didn't seem to have committed any major sins. Apart from the time when he was studying magic in the church, he would often doze off during the morning and evening prayer classes, but even so, such a tragic fate shouldn't have fallen on the head of Lord Todoro. Oh gods! I'm a mage. The noblest profession on the continent, a mage. Although he had been forced to wander to the wildfire plains because of his debt, Theodore had believed that his miserable fate had come to an end ever since he followed the noble and beautiful Her Highness to redeem himself from the hands of that vicious little thief. He knew of Adeline's noble status. As a lowly first-rank mage, if he could follow Her Highness, even if he couldn't say that his future was boundless, he would at least have a long-term meal ticket and wouldn't have to worry about food and drink. Unfortunately, Todoro's wishful thinking didn't come to fruition. The poor thing didn't have any intention of letting Todoro follow her. In fact, the poor thing knew that once she went back, her fate would be unknown. How could she let Todoro follow her? Moreover, when she took Todoro away, she simply wanted to prevent this guy from revealing her true identity to the country bumpkins. And after taking Todoro away, the poor thing forced the mage to swear a magic oath on the road. Although it was a lowly oath, it had magical properties, and it was enough to keep this guy's mouth tightly shut. Therefore, when they returned to Wildfire Town, the poor thing let Todoro go and let him fend for himself. Of course, the kind poor thing didn't mistreat this mage. After all, they had gone through thick and thin together. Before leaving, poor thing asked Chip Knight to give him a considerable amount of money. Although it wasn't a lot, 100 gold coins was enough for the mage to spend for a long time. Moreover, the poor thing naively thought that she had done a good deed. After all, she had helped the mage regain his freedom, but the poor thing was wrong. For someone like Todoro, he didn't have any self-defense skills. His magic was too weak. In a place like Wildfire Town, where vicious people roamed the streets, it was no different from throwing a fat sheep into a wolf's den. What was even more unfortunate was that this fat sheep was carrying 100 gold coins, a fortune that would make anyone's eyes go red with envy. Thus, Todoro was in trouble. What angered the magician the most was that he had met the same group of villains who had robbed him last time. Last time, they had stripped him naked and thrown him outside the city gate. Who would have thought that this fat sheep would come knocking on his door again, and bring him another windfall? The villains happily accepted this unexpected gain, while the poor magician was once again stripped naked and thrown into a corner of the city walls. Out of kindness, the villains left the magician's underwear this time. The poor thing probably didn't think that her kindness would cause the magician to suffer such a tragic fate. If Wildfire Town hadn't been taken over by the army, then Todoro could have sold himself into slavery again as a servant of some merchant caravan. With his ability to write and calculate, he could at least be considered a cultured person. At the very least, he would have been able to make ends meet. Unfortunately, Todoro was in the same situation as Shea, encountering a group of able-bodied soldiers. What was even worse was that the poor magician wasn't as strong as Shea. He also tried to escape, but after being whipped a few times, the magician became well-behaved. He was brought into the civilian camp and gloriously became a coolie, silently contributing to the Byzantine Empire's war against the invaders. The gluttonous and lazy magician became the most bullied person in the camp. His physical strength was very poor, and he always lagged behind in his work, but he ate no less than the others. Naturally, he was beaten up by the soldiers supervising him every 2 to 3 days. Of course, it wasn't that he didn't try to explain his identity. He was a glorious and noble magician, but unfortunately, his words were treated as crazy. When he tried to use magic, a dust-blowing spell instead angered the soldiers supervising him. Fuck. You dare throw sand at Lao Tzu. In the end, all the magician got was another beating. Before meeting Shea, the poor magician had already struggled in the camp for many days. If one were to talk about the pitiful fate of the magicians in the continent for thousands of years, Todoro was probably the first in history, and there would be no one to surpass him in the future. As a magician, to be so pitiful! If this news were to spread, all the magicians on the continent would be so ashamed that they would want to kill themselves. Of course, before they did that, they would first kill this disgraced Todoro. Todoro sat on the ground, telling Shea about his miserable experience with tears and snot. After all, they were acquaintances, and even Shea couldn't help but sympathize with this guy. All right, I want this guy. He turned to the fat officer and announced, I want him, he will be my squire. When can I take him away? The fat officer looked at Todoro as if he was an animal. This guy was so thin that he didn't have much meat, leaving him in the camp would be a waste of food. Thus, the corrupt officer showed a respectful smile. You can take him away at any time, as long as you are willing. So, after going around in a big circle, the magician once again fell into Shea's evil clutches. Leaving the glorious status of a coolie, the magician's new identity was that of a cavalry squire. Fine, a squire is a squire, at least it's 100 times better than being a coolie. But Shea's words shattered the magician's fantasy. This country bumpkin smiled and announced, "From now on, you are my saw-saw." The only one who had doubts about this was Kevin. Looking at the skinny guy that Shea took away, and pitifully following behind the two, Kevin couldn't help but look back at this suspicious guy. No matter how he looked, he felt that this guy's appearance was really wretched and shifty-eyed. Moreover, from Kevin's professional point of view, this guy really didn't look like a qualified squire who could do the job. He looked a little cunning, and didn't look like the kind who could endure hardships. Moreover, his body was thin and weak, and didn't look like someone who could do manual labor. One must know that the cavalry's equipment was very heavy. Could this guy even move it? Why did you choose such a guy? Kevin sighed. An old acquaintance. I thought he was too pitiful in the coolie camp. Shea answered very casually. Oh? What did he do before? Did he know any crafts? Shea thought for a moment. Well, a magician. Magician. The magician behind him burst into tears. What's the use of a magician? He doesn't look like he can work very well. And this guy seems a little cunning. Kevin expressed his uneasy concern. After all, a squire was still very important to a cavalry. Shea grinned, and a strange light flashed in his eyes. He answered Kevin's question. Don't worry, he will be obedient. My adoptive father taught me a sentence. Filial sons are born under the rod. The magician vomited blood. God, please pray for me, please bless me. Chapter 65. Block. Left. Block. Right. Down. Block again. Watch your steps. Don't keep retreating. Use your footsteps. Yes. Again. Following Kevin's deep voice, he raised a wooden hammer in his hand and attacked Shea again and again. Shea was also holding a wooden axe, but the handle had been lengthened to about a meter long. Shea braced himself and blocked Kevin's attack. Kevin's attack speed was not too fast, and both of them were restraining their strength. This training had been going on for several hours. Shea's black hair was soaked with sweat and stuck to his forehead. Kevin was also panting, and his bald head was covered with sweat. The two of them advanced and retreated, one attacking and one defending. The wooden weapons in their hands clashed for more than 10 times. Finally, Kevin suddenly took a step forward and lowered his body slightly. He leaned forward and rushed forward, and his hammer hit Shea's thigh. Then, he flicked his hammer upwards and sent the wooden axe in Shea's hand flying. Stop! Kevin exhaled and motioned for Shea to pick up the axe. The bald man looked at Shea, whose face was flushed red due to the strenuous exercise. After panting for a while, he said with a wry smile, Very good, this time you blocked 27 of my strikes, and I only hit you 3 times. Whistling sounds immediately came from the side. More than 10 soldiers had gathered around to watch. Among them, the one who whistled the loudest was the cunning Kato. He clapped his hands and laughed. Good job, Shea. Well done. Then, Kato smiled and extended his hand to his companions. Pay up, pay up. Hurry up, don't go back on your words. The group of personal guards laughed and cursed as they took out more or less copper coins and silver coins. Kevin, did you not eat breakfast? You hit so hard. You made Lao Tzu lose money again. Shea, you're not AF** King Human. The money I lost will be on your account. Haha. You have to treat everyone to a drink the next time you get your pay. This training had been going on for 3 days. During the scouting mission last time, Shea showed great fighting strength. which made Kevin admire him. The two of them lived in the same tent, and when they were free, they practiced martial arts. Kevin discovered a major flaw in Shea's strength. When this guy fought, he completely relied on his strength and super strong physique to bully others. When it came to martial arts, he was simply a mess. Of course, this mess didn't mean that Shea's martial arts were too bad. On the contrary, his attacking methods were very powerful, especially when he used the chopping firewood axe technique. Even with Kevin's extraordinary strength, he was unable to withstand it. His moves were simply strange and unpredictable. It was obviously a chopping and killing axe technique, but it was used by Shea to appear and disappear mysteriously. Even with Kevin's strength, which had reached the level of a level 1 warrior, he couldn't block Shea's axes. Even if Shea was stupid, he understood that the army of destruction that the old guy taught him was definitely a very powerful axe technique. But compared to Shea's offensive moves, his defensive ability was simply terrible to the extreme. This couldn't be blamed on him, because when the old guy was alive, he didn't seriously and systematically teach him martial arts. The army of destruction was integrated into his daily chop of firewood, coal, and other miscellaneous things. As for defensive martial arts, Shea had never practiced it. In the past, when he faced enemies, he relied on his strong physique and the swift and violent reaction he trained in fighting with wild beasts in the forest to deal with them. But after all, this was limited to his instincts, and he didn't systematically learn defensive moves. If he only knew how to attack and not defend, then he wouldn't be able to survive for long on the battlefield. Kevin didn't know that Shea had a super strong physique strengthened by the dragon's blood. But even with the dragon's blood strengthening his physique, it wasn't omnipotent. At the very least, if he met an opponent who knew fighting aura, they would be able to break through Shea's physical defense. Therefore, the shortcoming of his defensive skills became Shea's biggest flaw. If he met an ordinary opponent, he could still deal with them, but if he met a strong enemy, he would be in a difficult situation. At least, Shea was very clear in his heart that the last time he encountered those Dark Night Kingsmen, if it wasn't for the magic crystal left to him by the old man suddenly exploding, he would have already become a pile of bones on the wildfire plain. Kevin enthusiastically began to teach Shea some basic combat skills, especially focusing on training Shea's defensive move. When the two of them practiced, they didn't use fighting aura or real strength. They just practiced their moves. In the beginning, if Shea didn't use his monstrous strength, Kevin would knock his weapon out of his hand in 2 or 3 moves at most, and then his vital parts would be hit very quickly. On the first day, Shea was taught a terrible lesson by Kevin. When the two of them practiced, the other bodyguards who were watching by the side laughed loudly. Because from the beginning to the end, it was simply Shea who was being abused one-sidedly. That night, the country bumpkin almost didn't sleep at all. In his mind, he repeatedly recalled the offensive moves that Kevin used during the day, as well as the defensive skills that Kevin explained to him. When Kevin woke up at dawn, he saw his comrade sitting on the bed in a daze with red eyes. On the second day of the trial, Shea made great progress. Under Kevin's attacks, he withstood more than 10 moves before his vital parts were hit. This situation immediately attracted the other bodyguards who were practicing. Everyone immediately scrambled to be the referee. The rest of the bodyguards started to bet on how long this rookie could last under Kevin's attack. Although he was teased by everyone, Shea was very clear that these teasing were good intentions. It was full of the kind of teasing between comrades, and this was also a good sign. At least it meant that he was beginning to be accepted by this group. After returning from the scouting mission, Kevin didn't hide the fact that Shea had saved his life. Moreover, this straightforward bald man also expressed his approval of Shea. With the help of Kevin, who had quite a bit of prestige in the bodyguards, Shea was quickly accepted by the bodyguards. Moreover, he had a forthright personality. This kind of personality was very popular in the military environment. On the second day of the trial, in the last round of the trial, Shea not only blocked all of Kevin's attacks, but also hit Kevin once when he counterattacked. Although it wasn't a vital part, for everyone, this was already an amazing progress. Everyone realized that this kid was really something. On the third day of the trial, even more people were attracted. Later on, some of the more skilled bodyguards even volunteered to take turns with Kevin to teach Shea a lesson. In Katuo's words, they were going to beat this rookie up for free. "You're too nervous. You're paying too much attention to your footsteps and you're forgetting the movements of your hands. You have to make this your instinct. If you deliberately think about it and then move, it'll inevitably be slower." Kevin shared his experience very seriously. "All right, Kevin. You must be angry because you didn't hit Shea's weapon in the set number of times." "Ha ha ha ha." The tallest and most burly man next to him grinned and laughed. "Sharba, shut up, Lao Tzu." Kevin laughed and scolded. "If you have the ability, you can compete with Shea yourself." "Me? I won't do it. I don't have the hobby of wrestling with a bull." The burly man rubbed his chin. This guy was called Sharba, and he was also a member of the bodyguard. Before Shea came, he was recognized as the strongest bodyguard in the bodyguard. However, one night ago, he and Shea had a fair wrestling match. Shea almost broke some of his bones, so he was convinced. Comparing strength, it seemed that he, a human, couldn't compete with that monster. After 3 days, Shea had become familiar with most of the bodyguards. Of course, Kevin had contributed a lot to this. Although he couldn't use brute force, Shea was still half dead from exhaustion after the trial every day. His whole body was soaked with sweat, as if he had just been fished out of the water. Looking at this country bumpkin returning to the tent, Todoro cursed in his heart, "I hope he's beaten to a pulp." Although he thought so, he hurriedly put on a respectful smile and greeted him. "Master Shea, you're back." Shea directly threw the wooden axe to Kevin. Although it was made of wood, the huge axe almost knocked Todoro to the ground. He barely held on to the axe and staggered after Shea. "Go get some water, I want to take a bath. Also, have you fed the horses? It's my turn to patrol tonight. Don't forget to wipe my armor clean." Shea threw himself onto the bed, so tired that he felt as if all the bones in his body were about to fall apart. Todoro obediently trotted out, but his face immediately became indignant. He grabbed a brush from the corner of the wall and ran to take out a set of heavy light cavalry armor. He carefully brushed the dust on it, and then carefully applied lubricating oil to the joints of the armor. The poor magician was covered in oil dust, and his face was covered in dirt. He cursed his unfair fate in his heart. Chapter 66. It had been 3 days since he returned from the scouting mission. In these 3 days, the 13th Cavalry Division had stepped up their preparations for battle. Large amounts of resources and equipment were transported to the encampment. Just last night, an emblem group of cavalry had already left the military camp to conduct a search in the north according to the battle plan. Meanwhile, the central military tent had also become busier. In these 3 days, one emblem group after another's generals had entered and exited the tent continuously. The battle conference had been carried out intensely, all the missions had been assigned, and the security of the encampment had been raised to the highest level. However, all this had nothing to do with Shea for the time being. He lay on the bed, his mind still replaying what he had learned from today's training. At the same time, he seized the opportunity to rest. He had to fully recover his physical strength during the short 1 hour of rest. Although he had never really been on the battlefield, Shea had already tasted the cruelty of war during that short encounter with Odin's Icefield hunters in the forest. He liked staying in this place and the new friends around him. Whether it was Kevin, Katua, or the burly man Sharba, he liked them all very much. These fellows were forthright and straightforward, and were very direct with others. Especially once he was accepted by them, he would receive their sincere treatment. Such an atmosphere was definitely not present in Wildfire Town. For the past 18 years, other than the short adventure on Wildfire Plains, Shea had never had any real friends. Therefore, he cherished this feeling very much. However, he was also very clear that this was an army. An army had to fight. War, on the other hand, was cruel. Therefore, he had to practice his skills well. He had been practicing martial arts hard during the day and taking the initiative to apply for patrol missions at night. This was so that he could seize the opportunity to practice his equestrian skills. Every time Shea went on patrol, he would seize the time to ask the other cavalrymen who were patrolling with him about the assassination techniques on horseback. He was very clear that the simplest technique could become his life-saving trump card on the battlefield in the future. This was not because he was smart, but because he had trained his vigilance from fighting with wild beasts in the forest since he was young. An hour of rest passed very quickly. Poor Todoro had brought water, but Shea had no time to take a bath. He quickly jumped up, put on the armor that the Magus had wiped clean, and rushed out of the tent. The Magus spat behind him, threw the brush on the ground, and lay on Shea's bed. "God, please bless this country bumpkin and let him fall off his horse during patrol," the Magus prayed sincerely in his heart. After joining the patrol team according to orders, Shea had just followed the team out of the encampment when he saw a group of cavalrymen slowly approaching from afar. The cavalrymen at the front of the Empire's army were in formation. "Who are they?" Shea asked his companions. "They are the guys from the 6th Corps. I heard that they will be here in 2 days. Rookie, you are so lucky to be here in time for a big battle." An experienced cavalryman next to him laughed. The cavalrymen quickly changed their formation and waved the flag of an ally from afar. The patrol team immediately made way for the cavalrymen to pass through on the main road. Shea and the other cavalrymen of the patrol team watched the cavalrymen pass by them. There were not many cavalrymen, only about 100 of them. In the middle of the cavalrymen was a man who looked like a general riding on a red horse. The general had a big waist and big shoulders. Although he was wearing a full set of golden armor, he did not have a trace of vigor. Instead, he looked bloated. "That is General Rohr of the 6th Corps." A cavalryman next to him told Shea. "General?" Shea immediately compared this guy with General Adric, and then a trace of disdain appeared in his heart. This guy looked more like a cook. He was born a cook. Another cavalryman laughed softly and said, "General Rohr is a member of the Minas family. He used to be the Duke of Minas's cook. Later on, for some reason, he was promoted by the Duke of Minas. The Duke of Minas is also a famous commander of the Empire. In his entire life, he has misjudged this guy." It was clear that the cavalrymen of the 13th Corps looked at General Rohr with disdain. In fact, they had reason to look down on General Rohr. The tradition of the 13th Corps was advance or die. In the history of the Corps, this Iron Army had never retreated even once. However, this General Rohr had a special record in the Byzantine Empire. The troops that he commanded were always the ones that suffered the least losses and were the ones that were kept the most intact at the end of every war. This was because General Rohr seemed to have an extremely special talent. He could always predict or sense impending danger, and then lead his troops to quickly retreat before the danger arrived. Note, it was retreat, not escape. This guy would never lead his troops away from battle in violation of military orders, because if he did, he would be punished by military law. The special characteristic of General Rohr was that he could always find a way out in the most dangerous situation and lead his men to safely retreat. There was once a war where General Rohr was only a flag-bearer of an emblem group. He led his troops as the vanguard. Because the enemy suddenly made a detour, he directly went to the rear and defeated the main force at the rear. This caused General Rohr's troops to be trapped in the enemy's territory. In the end, General Rohr displayed an ability that made all the Byzantium generals gasp in admiration. He led his 2,000 subordinates, and under the encirclement of over 40,000 enemy troops, he forcibly found a gap in the complicated terrain and ran out of the enemy's territory. Apart from a few soldiers who sprained their ankles during the escape, he actually didn't lose a single soldier. If it wasn't a miracle, this kind of command could be considered as a masterpiece of art. General Rohr had been in the army for 30 years, and he had never fought a hard battle. However, his troops were always able to complete missions such as providing support from the side or taking a detour. His troops advanced quickly and retreated at a frightening speed. Moreover, he had also set an amazing record among all the generals of the Byzantine Empire. His troops had once faced the publicly acknowledged number one general of the continent, the Ottoman Empire's war god Hastings. Hastings was publicly acknowledged as the number one general of the continent, and also the proudest war god of the Ottoman Empire's army. The Byzantine Empire had always won and lost against the Ottoman Empire, but against Hastings's army, they had always lost more than they won. Even the 13th Cavalry Division of the Iron Army had suffered a great loss. However, General Rohr was different. About 6 years ago, the war between the two empires broke out. At that time, General Rohr had just been promoted to general and commanded a division. Unfortunately, his army encountered Hastings's army on the battlefield. The military order that Rohr received was that he had to delay Hastings's army for at least 2 days. General Rohr very boldly sent someone to issue a letter of challenge to Hastings. The letter was filled with heroic words, inviting Hastings to a decisive battle on the battlefield. The letter of challenge was written with great integrity, and even stated that although he knew that he was not Hastings's opponent, but, to defend the dignity of a martial artist, to defend the glory of the Empire's soldiers, my army swears to fight to the death, to use blood to write down the integrity of the Byzantine army. To be able to fight with you, even if I die, I will have no regrets. These were the original words of that letter of challenge. Seeing such an opponent with the demeanor of a knight, Hastings was overjoyed, and agreed to such a request. He even sent someone to write a very respectful reply to the letter of challenge. In the end, when Hastings prepared for the decisive battle 2 days later, he led his troops to Rohr's camp, only to find that the camp was already empty. It turned out that after General Rohr received Hastings' reply, he abandoned all the military supplies and equipment that night, and fled with his troops. When Hastings angrily chased after him, Rohr's troops were already 200 li away. Although all the military supplies and equipment were abandoned, Rohr did not receive any punishment from the military because he successfully delayed Hastings for 2 days. Hastings made an evaluation of this despicable opponent. Among all the generals of Byzantium, this Rohr is the most despicable and cunning. He is simply a fox. No, even a fox is braver than him. He is simply a rabbit that runs very fast. From then on, General Rohr received a nickname, Rabbit Run Fast. There was another interesting matter. The letter of challenge that Rohr wrote to Hastings was torn to pieces in anger when Hastings realized that he had been tricked. However, after this fierce general of Odin calmed down, he stuck the letter of challenge back together and kept it with him, reminding himself not to be arrogant and careless when facing an enemy in the future. When this practice spread out, it also indirectly increased the reputation of General Rohr. Watching Rohr's troops pass by, Shea heard about the rabbit general's glorious past from the cavalrymen's mouths. Unlike the cavalrymen, he looked at the distant cavalrymen with eyes that didn't have the slightest bit of disdain, but instead revealed a bit of contemplation and admiration. This fatso is definitely not a simple coward. Chapter 67. In order to welcome the arrival of General Rohr of the 6th Corps, General Adric personally came out of the tent to welcome him. Looking at the Empire's most famous rabbit general, who was only able to dismount from his horse with the help of his personal guards, Adrik felt his heart twitching. What the hell? The people in the military command are all crazy. How could they send such a person to work with the 13th Division? Arranging a rabbit and a lion together? The person who came up with this plan should be hanged. No matter what, the arrival of the 6th Corps was an ally. Even if Adrik was unwilling in his heart, he couldn't show it on his face. This General Roer was very enthusiastic. After dismounting, he slightly tidied up his appearance and strode forward to give Adrik a bear hug. He was tall and bulky, so this hug was quite imposing. Then Roer's loud and clear voice could be heard laughing. To be able to fight side by side with the Empire's most famous Iron Army, this time the 6th Corps is deeply honored. Even though we have known each other for many years, but this is the first time we have fought side by side against an enemy. With the 13th Corps here, I am sure those Odin people will be terrified. Not only was he tall and big, even when he spoke, his voice was loud and clear, and his tone was extremely heroic. If one didn't know his identity, just by looking at his mannerisms, one would definitely think that he was a man full of heroism. Who would have guessed that this was the Empire's famous rabbit general? Adrik didn't know whether to laugh or not, so he coughed with a straight face and gently shook off Roer's hug. He stared at Roer with his sharp eyes and said slowly in a low voice, "General Roer, since the military command has ordered us to form an army, then I will naturally obey the command. But on the battlefield, I hope that the 6th Corps can fulfill the duty of a comrade. Our 13th Corps will naturally bite the hardest bone. I only hope that when we leave our backs to our comrades will not let us down." Roer's face didn't have the slightest bit of embarrassment. With his reputation, who knows how many times he had heard such words of distrust over the years? His face was already thicker than the city walls. Hearing this, he only laughed. Don't worry. Even though our 6th Corps isn't some ace army, but we will definitely not drag the 13th Corps down." "Of course you won't drag us down. If there's any danger, you would have already run away." Adrik's eyes twitched. Roer then laughed 3 times. "All right, General Adrik, let me introduce the special envoy sent by the military command. Sir Bonfret from the Imperial Military Headquarters. He came to my unit 2 days ago, and brought the order from Ostjilla. This time he was ordered to be a front-line observer, ha 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 ha." As soon as he heard the name Bonfret, Adaric's expression, which was still barely restraining himself, instantly changed. Roer stepped aside, revealing a human figure behind his bear-like body. This Sir Bonfret had been standing behind Roer all along. However, Roer's body was too big, so General Adrik only saw this special envoy now. This is ridiculous. Why did the military send such a bastard here? Adrik's expression immediately darkened. Sir Bonfret behind Roer was of medium height and slender build. He wore a set of exquisite silver armor, which was the most popular retro Holy Knights armor in Ostjilla this year. This armor had 2 main characteristics. First, it was gorgeous. The entire armor was covered with a layer of glittering silver plates. The entire breastplate was concave and convex, with exquisite patterns engraved on it. The patterns were even soaked in red iris flower juice, and the joints were sewn with silver and gold thread. The inner lining of the armor was made of high-quality fox fur, and a soft fox fur was turned over at the collar to protect the neck of the wearer from being scratched by the hard armor. The shoulder pads and arm guards were polished very thin, and the slightly upturned style made them look particularly valiant. However, from the perspective of a professional warrior, this kind of metal plate with hollow patterns could be pierced through with a light poke of an iron sword. Therefore, the second characteristic of this kind of armor was its fragility. Rather than calling it armor, it would be more accurate to call it a set of luxurious noble clothing. Sir Bonfret himself was extraordinarily handsome. He was 33 years old this year, but his skin was fair, and his facial features were as delicate as a woman's. His face carried a sickly paleness, and his slender eyes, the corners of which were slightly raised, gave him a natural charm. He stood in front of General Audiobook. Even though he was wearing a set of gorgeous armor, it accentuated his feminine temperament and gave off a hint of fragility. He pursed his lips and smiled shyly. He raised his hand and gently covered his nose. He was wearing a pair of spotless white silk gloves. The most chilling thing was that one of his little fingers was actually slightly curled up. He walked in front of General Audiobook. Looking at the way he walked, it didn't seem like he was in a military camp, but more like he was taking a stroll in a ball. Seeing such a knight, Audiobook's face instantly turned as ugly as it could be. Because, although Roer, the escaped general, had a bad reputation, at least he could be considered a soldier. At least he had been on the battlefield. But this Sir Bonfret, well, if Roer's nickname was Rabbit, then this Mr. Bonfret was a real rabbit. There was no one in the capital who didn't know this beautiful knight's name. He was 33 years old, and was born in a noble family. Unfortunately, he wasn't the eldest son, so he couldn't inherit the title. However, because of his extraordinary good looks, he was the most famous handsome man in the imperial capital since he was young. Most importantly, he had a famous lover. This lover was the current crown prince of the imperial capital. It was said that this crown prince didn't like women, but preferred men. And this Sir Bonfret was the most favored person of His Highness the Crown Prince. In recent years, because he was favored by His Highness the Crown Prince, this Sir Bonfret's status in the imperial capital Australia skyrocketed. His power was illustrious, and everyone looked askance at him. In the noble circle of the imperial capital, who didn't know this Jazz who relied on selling his ass to win a life of glory and wealth? Such a person was actually sent to his own army? What was the military trying to do? Audiobook's face was livid as he exchanged glances with the knight. He snorted and barely suppressed his anger as he nodded his head in greeting. Then, he turned around and walked into the tent. Humph! Sir Bonfret also snorted in dissatisfaction. Roer smiled and said, Sir Bonfret, you must be tired from the journey. You should go back to your tent and rest. This handsome man's face showed dissatisfaction. He covered his nose and said in a thin and sharp voice, I was ordered to be an observer. How can I slack off when I have a military order? He frowned. The smell here is really bad. Is the entire military camp so smelly? Please use my tent first. I'm sure it'll be very clean. I'll send someone to invite you in during the military meeting. Roer politely chatted with him for a while. Then he asked a few attendants to send this Sir Jazz away. The rabbit general scratched his head and walked into the tent. As soon as he entered the tent, he saw Audiobook's angry eyes. Roer spread out his hands and said loudly, Don't blame me. It was not my decision to bring him here. It was a military order from above. I can only bring him along. Audiobook sat there and twirled the dagger in his hand. He sneered, sending this Jazz to the front line. Is His Highness the Crown Prince not worried that his beloved will die on the front line? Roer found a place to sit down. Looking at the position of the bodyguards outside the tent, he lowered his voice and laughed. I think there are two possibilities for this guy to come here. It may not be a bad thing, my dear General Audiobook. What? Audiobook frowned, the scar on his face twisted. Sending this guy to my army is simply ridiculous. The first one. Perhaps it was not His Highness the Crown Prince's idea to send him here, but His Majesty's. In recent years, His Highness the Crown Prince and this Jazz have been fighting too much. Furthermore, His Majesty's health is deteriorating day by day. The Crown Prince will inherit the throne sooner or later, but with such a male pet by his side, His Majesty is uneasy. He is always worried that in the future, the Crown Prince will always favor this Jazz and not get close to women. No matter how handsome this Jazz is, men can't have children, Ha 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 ha. Then the royal family will probably have no successor. So, perhaps he purposely ordered this Jazz to be sent to the front line, hoping that he will die on the front line, so as to stop the crown prince's thoughts. Adrik put the dagger back and frowned. There is also the second possibility. That is, the higher-ups have already received information that we are not in the Odin's main attacking direction, so they are not worried to send this guy here. Perhaps it is His Highness the Crown Prince's idea to promote this Jazz, so he gave him the status of an observer to gain experience and gild his reputation. Adrik snorted, but thought in his heart, perhaps he knows about your ability to escape, so he stuffed this disgusting guy to your side. Even if there is danger, with an escape expert like you protecting him, he will be safe. The two generals looked at each other, each with their own thoughts. Roar pondered for a while and said seriously, "My troops are just behind and will arrive here early tomorrow morning. 1 light infantry and 2 heavy infantry regiments. I left all the transport supplies behind, and the higher-ups are in a hurry. In order to hurry, I brought my direct cavalry here first." Adrik sighed, stood up, and put down the map on the wall. He pointed at the map and said seriously, "Let's not talk about other things first. Odin's vanguard has already appeared in Albacete. The last scout came into contact with them about 150 miles to the north. The other party has an Icefield hunter as a scout. You should know that the ones who can have an Icefield hunter as a scout are all Odin's elite troop." As he said, he smiled maliciously as if he was doing it on purpose. "Perhaps, this time we will meet your old friend, Hastings." The fat on Roar's face suddenly trembled, and then he shook his head with a straight face and said, "Even if we meet Hastings we will just fight to the death. Besides, with you, the Empire's Lion commander leading the 13th Division, even if Hastings comes, we will not be afraid of him." Although his words were pleasant to hear, Auderic sneered and then said solemnly, "General Roar, since we're cooperating, I'll tell you the truth. My 13th Division will take on the toughest bone. But we are cavalry after all. When the two armies meet, the 6th Corps must guard the middle. My cavalry will be in charge of the flanks. You just need to guard the center and don't take a step back." Roar laughed. "It seems that your army is still a little afraid of my name." The rabbit general stood up and walked to the side of the map. He pinched his chin and looked at it for a while, then pointed at a position on the map. "Here, the terrain is most suitable for a decisive battle. We will wait here for Odin's men to come and fight them off. I feel that Albacete might not be their main target." After a pause, Fatso took a deep breath and stared into General Adrik's eyes. "I will also say it directly. My men are infantry. So if the situation is not right and we need to retreat, the task of covering the rear can only be handed over to you. 4-legged men can run faster than 2-legged men, right?" Adrik's eyes flashed, and he nailed the dagger on the map. "It's a deal." When Shea returned from his patrol, the sky was already completely dark. He was not on duty tonight. When he returned to the tent, he saw Kevin arranging the equipment. The bald man was wiping his mace excitedly, his eyes flashing with fire. "What's wrong?" Shea saw that the bald man was actually wearing a pair of horse boots. "Don't sleep tonight, we will set off before dawn." The bald man laughed and punched Shea. "Get ready! According to our tradition, the general will personally lead the first emblem group on the road, and us personal guards will naturally follow the general." Chapter 68. Before dawn the next day, the 13th Corps indeed set off. General Adrik personally led the men of the first emblem group and set off first. The third emblem group, led by the silver-haired man, Butler, who was the vanguard, had already sent back a military report. There were 2 small-scale battles with Odin's men in the northern part of the Albacete plains. The scale of the battles was about 100 men, and both sides won 1 battle each. The location of the battle was about 10 miles south of the small forest where Shea and his men had been attacked by the scouts. It was obvious that the Odin's army was approaching the south step by step. They had extended their tentacles deep into the Albacete plains. As a member of the personal guards, Shea wore a full set of cavalry equipment and set off with the rest of the troop. The only thing that made Shea a little disappointed was that he didn't get the legendary cavalry equipment that Kata had mentioned last time. Those 4-meter-long spears, huge shields that were half the height of a person, and even horse armor that was equipped with horses. What he got was still the same set of ordinary light cavalry equipment that he had gotten when the scouts set off last time. There was a double-edged sword for infantry, a shield for infantry, and a long weapon for mounted combat. Shea still chose an axe and spear. On the way, Shea told the doubts in his heart to his comrades around him, and soon his doubts were explained. The one who explained was the former strongest man in the personal guards, Sharba. Of course, since he was defeated by Shea in a wrestling match, he had been relegated to second place. The burly man laughed. "You've been misled by Katua. The equipment that Rat Katua was talking about is our heavy cavalry. A full set of heavy cavalry armor, a 4-meter-long spear, a shield that is half the size of a man, and horse armor. Think about it, how heavy would such a cavalry be if they only wore a full set of equipment? How would an ordinary soldier be able to afford it? Only the elites who are carefully selected from the army can fight with such heavy armor. Ordinary people, like that Rat Katua, would have been pressed down long ago." After a pause, the boorish man lowered his voice. "Also, think about it. How much iron would such a heavy set of armor consume? Also, the war horses of the heavy cavalry had to be good breeds that could carry heavy load. Even in our 13th Corps, only the 4th and 1st Banner has this kind of heavy cavalry. If you want to be a heavy cavalryman, when you have the chance, you can plead with the general and ask him to demote you to the 4th Banner." Shea immediately felt relieved. It was indeed impossible to equip a troop class like the heavy cavalry on a large scale. He had thought too much before. In fact, strictly speaking, the first emblem group that Shea was in wasn't really a cavalry unit. The first emblem group under the 13th Cavalry Division was actually a mounted infantry combat unit. Mounted infantry, as the name suggested, was strictly an infantry unit. However, in order to increase mobility, these infantrymen used horses to march and dismounted to form infantry formations during battle. After all, although cavalry units were powerful, they couldn't fight on a large scale alone. They also needed the cooperation of infantry unit. Generally speaking, cavalry units couldn't fight head-on in a field battle as an independent troop class, except for surprise attacks. It was actually very rare for thousands of cavalry units to charge head-on and directly attack the enemy's infantry formations. The real way to unleash the cavalry's power was to place the cavalry on the two flanks and attack the enemy's flanks, penetrating them layer by layer like peeling potatoes. As an independent division, the 13th Cavalry Division was equipped with some infantry unit. However, in order to maintain the mobility of the cavalry division, the infantry were upgraded to mounted infantry to maintain the speed of movement. Moreover, in a siege battle, a pure cavalry unit wouldn't be of much use. They could only rely on infantry unit. The first emblem group set off to provide support to the vanguard third emblem group that went north a few days ago. Shea marched with the personal guards. Along the way, he listened to his companions talk about some of the battle tactics of the 13th Division. Although these personal guards might not know much, as personal guards, they would often hear some military reports by the general's side. They were influenced by what they saw and heard, so they were more knowledgeable than normal soldiers. On the first day of the journey, it was the first time Shea followed a large troop of more than 1,000 people. In the legends that he had heard in the past, there were battles involving thousands of soldiers and horses. Although it was only an emblem group of 2,000 people, Shea couldn't help but sigh when he saw the dark mass of cavalry stretching out on the plains. The strict military discipline of the 13th Cavalry Division and the orderly marching squadrons were solemn and quiet, but there was a murderous aura around them. And this was only the men of one emblem group. If they were to gather an entire army or even a few armies, how exciting would that scene be? The troops didn't rest at night. The soldiers of the 13th Division were already used to this level of marching. The soldiers could eat, drink, and even rest on their horses. They galloped all the way until dawn of the second day. In the morning, General Adric then ordered the troops to stop and rest for a while. The personal guards were considered more special because they were the only true cavalry unit in this cavalry unit. Everyone had a horse. Shea happened to be assigned to General Adaric's side during his shift. He, Kevin, and a dozen other bodyguards were guarding Adaric's side. General Adric was still wearing the black leather robe that Shea had first seen him in. However, his brows were tightly knitted. His eyes flashed with a chilling sharpness, just like a male lion. Rookie. Just as Shea was quietly sizing up Adric, the general suddenly turned his head and smiled at Shea. Huh! Shea immediately straightened his body. We're about to fight a big battle. Are you nervous? Adric had a strange smile at the corner of his mouth. The personal guards at the side all looked at Shea, as if they were curious about the general's question to this rookie. Shea thought for a while and shook his head. Not too nervous. Adric's gaze was somewhat satisfied. Why? Killing wild beasts is killing people is also killing. They want to kill us, so we naturally have to kill them. There's no difference. Shea answered without thinking. Interesting way to put it. Adric stared at Shea for a while and suddenly shook his head. You're a good kid. You're somewhat similar to a guy I knew in the past. However, you're not as powerful as that guy. Do a good job. You're quite skilled. If you can perform meritorious deeds in this battle, I'll let you be a cavalry captain when we return. The personal guards at the side immediately showed envious expressions. Adric looked at the bald man at the side. And you too, Kevin. If you can return alive this time, you can lead a battalion. The bald man immediately growled in excitement. His face was flushed red and even his bald head seemed to sparkle under the sunlight. Adric seemed to be in a good mood. He waved his hand to signal the end of the break. Just as he was about to mount his horse, his gaze suddenly changed and he abruptly raised his head to look at the sky. In the sky, between the blue sky and white clouds, a gray shadow spread its wings and circled. It looked like an eagle, but at a glance it was slightly smaller than a normal eagle. Its circling motion was also somewhat strange. After circling a few times above the first emblem group, it flipped and danced a few times. Adric's expression immediately darkened. Kevin squinted his eyes and took a look. His expression changed. General, it's Odin's. Yes, it's the wingman eagle. Adric's eyes flashed. If the wingman eagle is here, Odin's army must not be far away. Wu Ran turned to ask an officer beside him. How long has it been since we last heard from Butler and the others? The last batch of messengers came back yesterday evening. After that, there was no news, the officer replied. Adric's expression darkened. Map! The adjutant beside him immediately took the map from his back and unfolded it. Adric glanced at it and pointed to a spot on the map. How far is it from here? The place he pointed to was a long and narrow area. The terrain was slightly low-lying. It was in the middle of the plain. On both sides of the high ground were forests, and in the middle was a depression. Not too far. The one who answered was Shea. He said loudly without hesitation, I know that place. From here, if we rush at full speed, we can reach it in 2 hours at most. Are you sure? Auderic stared at Shea. In an instant, the general's eyes were frighteningly bright, and his flashing gaze was frightening. Shea braced himself and faced such a gaze. He gritted his teeth and said, I'm sure. I've been to that place twice. I'm familiar with the surrounding terrain. Something has happened. Adrik's eyes flashed with a dangerous light. Odin's wingman eagle is warning us. Something must have happened to Butler and the others in front. Otherwise, the wingman eagle wouldn't fly so close to the south to scout. Butler and the others haven't sent any messengers for the whole night. The general thought for a moment and looked at the few deputy generals beside him. Finally, his gaze landed on the bald man. Kevin. Yes. The bald man shouted excitedly as if he had been injected with chicken blood. I'll leave all the personal guards to you. There's also the scout team directly under the third emblem group. We can gather a total of 200 cavalrymen. You lead the team and immediately leave the team and head north at full speed. That guy Butler must have met with some trouble. Your mission is to support them. You will encounter obstacles on the way. You know what to do, right? Kevin immediately raised his mace and shouted excitedly, "Tear them apart! Idiot!" Adrik scolded. Don't linger when you encounter obstacles. Break through immediately. Your mission is to find Butler's troops and support them. I'll lead the team and catch up. He paused and glanced at Shea. Shea is familiar with the terrain. Let this rookie lead the way. As he spoke, he raised his head and looked at the wingman eagle flying in the sky. Suddenly, he felt irritated. He grabbed a bow from the saddle of a soldier beside him and aimed at the sky with an arrow. Buzz! As the bowstring vibrated, the arrow shot up like a ray of gray light. However, this bow was just an ordinary standard bow. Even though it was pulled to a full moon, the arrow only shot up for a while and fell when it was still a long distance away from the wingman eagle. Adrik was furious and pulled the bow again. This time, he pulled even harder. However, with a crack, the bow was broken by him. Bastard! Adrik was furious. If Vaya was here, he glared at Kevin. What are you waiting for? Execute the order immediately. Kevin hurriedly responded and hurriedly urged his horse to gallop out. A moment later, he gathered the personal guards together with all the scouts and cavalry, forming a small team of about 300 riders. Everyone, don't bring any horses. Don't bring any rations. Throw away all the unnecessary things. Set off immediately. The 13th Cavalry Division was indeed elite. In just a moment, the 300 cavalrymen were ready to set off. Kevin had some leadership skills. He easily formed the formation into a wedge and led the 300 cavalrymen away. Shea and Kevin were at the forefront of the cavalry, and he was responsible for leading the way. After galloping forward for about the time it takes to eat a meal, he saw steep hills gradually appear in the flat terrain ahead, and there was a sparse forest on a high ground on the left. Shea immediately shouted, "Soon, after passing that hill, keep running straight." As soon as he finished speaking, he saw a group of people coming out from the forest on the hill. They were all wearing leather armor. They were tall and burly, with messy hair. In their hands were short axes, large swords, and all sorts of weapons. They also raised round shields. About 100 or so people rushed out from the forest to meet the cavalry. These fellows didn't ride horses. Instead, they rode strange mounts. These mounts were similar in size to horses, but looked more majestic. They were covered in black fur and had 2 long horns on their heads. Shea felt strange when he saw this, but he heard Kevin anxiously shout, "It's Odin's reindeer cavalrymen! Charge!" The 2 groups of cavalrymen quickly collided. As they got closer, Shea heard the Odin's cavalrymen let out a series of howls. The reindeer mounts were even louder. The momentum of their galloping was even more astonishing than the horses. Gales buffeted their faces. Ping ping pang 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 sounds rang out as the 2 groups of cavalrymen fiercely collided. Shea and Kevin were at the front, charging into the Odin's formation. What was shameful was that Shea's horsemanship wasn't good enough. He was directly hit by a majestic reindeer, causing his horse's head to tilt. Shea immediately flipped over and fell off his horse. Chapter 69. As the country bumpkin fell to the ground, a reindeer's hoof came crashing down from the side. If the hoof landed on the ground, the country bumpkin's first cavalry charge would be the last battle of his life. Shea struggled to roll on the ground and brandished the halberd in his hand. With a caw sound, a deer's hoof flew up and a deer's leg was directly cut off by him. An Odin warrior on the deer's back roared and flew down, twisting with shit. The two of them rolled on the ground. Shea freed up a hand and punched the opponent's face. The Odin warrior's nose was smashed and he screamed miserably. Just as he was about to pounce on Shea again, he was suddenly trampled over by a cavalry horse rushing up from behind. The horse's hooves trampled on his back, breaking his bones and killing him. Before Shea could turn around, he heard the wind whistling behind him. An Odin's reindeer cavalryman wielding his axe rushed in front of him. The axe carried a cold light as it chopped towards Shea's shoulder. Shea immediately raised his halberd to block it. With a clang, the Odin soldier felt a powerful force and the axe was broken into two. Shea fiercely stomped on the ground and pounced forward, knocking the soldier off the reindeer's back with his shoulder. Shea rode on the reindeer's back, but the reindeer continued to run forward. Shea struggled to hold onto the reindeer's head. The reindeer's neck was almost broken by the country bumpkin. Shea exerted all his strength to hold onto the reindeer's neck. With a twist, the reindeer let out a mournful cry and fell to the ground. Shea fell to the ground and saw a cavalryman next to him being pulled down from his horse by Odin's people. Half of his head had been chopped off by an axe, and his brain was splattered everywhere. Shea's eyes turned red. He recognized that the cavalryman was a bodyguard of the personal guards, who had accompanied him in the trial a few days ago. Shea rushed forward and stabbed the halberd into the Odin soldier's stomach with both hands. With a flick, the corpse was sent flying. He leaped onto the horse of the cavalryman, kicked the horse's belly, and chased after the cavalryman. At this moment, the cavalry formation had already charged past them. After all, Odin only had 100 or so cavalry. It was much less than Kevin and the others. Shea was at the back of the group, and the Odin's men turned around to chase after him. Shea pulled out his sword from his saddle and threw it at the reindeer cavalryman at the front of the Odin's men. With a pew sound, the sword pierced through his chest and the Odin's man fell off his horse. Although the reindeer cavalry chased with all their might, the reindeer were still slower than the war horses. Just as they were about to open up some distance between them, a group of archers suddenly ran out from the forest. Although there weren't many of them, dozens of archers drew their bows and aimed their arrows at the charging human cavalrymen. "Raise your shields!" Kevin roared angrily. Arrows rained down from the sky. The first wave of arrows rained down, and the cavalrymen were caught off guard. In an instant, more than 10 of them were hit, and 7 or 8 cavalrymen fell off their horses. Seeing the archers draw their bows again, the cavalrymen raised their shields. However, they were still light cavalrymen after all, and the horses didn't have any armor. The distance between the high ground and the cavalrymen was about 100 steps, and the slope was about 5 or 6 meters. It was extremely difficult for the cavalrymen to charge up, and they had to go around it. However, the enemy had enough time to fire 5 or 6 waves of arrows. Shea's mind was clear at this moment, and all the distracting thoughts had been eliminated from his mind. There was only one thought in his mind: let the brothers charge over. The tragic death of the soldier who had half his head chopped off by Odin's men seemed to be right in front of his eyes. Shea only felt a sudden surge of hot blood in his chest. With a loud roar, he turned his horse around and broke away from the cavalrymen, charging towards the high ground. The horse galloped and rushed to the bottom of the slope. With a 5 or 6 meter drop, the horse couldn't charge up no matter what. Shea ignored it and kicked the horse's belly a few times, causing the horse to gallop wildly. Borrowing the momentum, it ran 3 or 4 steps up the slope before finally running out of energy. Shea had already released the stirrups and leapt up. He exerted all his strength and stomped down hard on the horse's back. He heard the horse neighing, and the horse's body suddenly lowered. Shea took advantage of this foothold and jumped up. This jump was a full 3 or 4 meters high. While in midair, he pulled out his flaming fork and stabbed it into the slope. Then, using the momentum, he somersaulted up the slope. With a halberd in his left hand and a flaming fork in his right, he roared and charged towards the archers at the side of the forest. At this moment, the archers had already completed their second volley of arrows. But all they saw was a fellow wearing Byzantium armor charging towards them like a madman. Shea sprinted with all his might. With a kick of his legs, he was able to cover a distance of 7 or 8 steps. Before the archers could react, he had already charged into the crowd. Brandishing his halberd, blood splattered, and 3 or 4 archers were chopped down by him. The rest of the archers were instantly thrown into chaos. One by one, they lowered their bows and drew their swords as they surrounded Shea. Shea roared again and again as his halberd hacked down viciously. The halberd cleaved the head and upper body of an archer into 2. Blood sprayed onto Shea's body and instantly dyed his upper body red. Shea's face was filled with minced meat and blood. He turned around and used his shoulder to knock away an archer. Then, he used his back to take on several sword strikes from the enemy. With his body strengthened by dragon blood, ordinary attacks were naturally unable to harm him. Shea only felt a burst of pain before he viciously slammed into the crowd of enemies. His strength was immense. With such a barbaric charge, 2 archers in front of him were sent flying while vomiting blood. Then, he repeatedly stabbed with his halberd, piercing through the heads of 3 archers. With a backhand swing of his halberd, he cleaved away another archer's sword. With a sweep of the axe, the enemy's arm was chopped off. That archer clutched his shoulder and wildly vomited blood. Shea finally suffered several vicious blows. It was probably an officer of the archer squad. A long sword emitting a milky white radiance of Do Chi ferociously chopped down on Shea's shoulder. The force of the Do Chi was so great that Shea was unable to stand. With a plop, he knelt on the ground. The edge of the Do Chi directly chopped apart the armor on his shoulder. Even with dragon blood strengthening his body, he could not withstand the Do Chi attack. Blood immediately flowed out from his shoulder. However, the officer's face was aghast. His Do Chi attack was definitely enough to chop a person into 2 pieces. However, even though the sword had cut open Shea's armor, it did not even cut through Shea's bones. The blade was stuck on Shea's shoulder bone, but it was unable to move even an inch further. Shea roared in pain. He struggled to turn around. Under the pain, his strength erupted and he directly knocked the officer away. The officer roared in a low voice. Once again, the Do Chi radiance burst out from the blade. The Do Chi carried an explosive attribute as it exploded. Shea's shoulder suddenly burst out with a flower of blood. Flesh and blood burst out like rain. Shea screamed miserably. His eyes widened and turned crimson red. With a backhand, he stabbed his halberd into the officer's head, piercing a hole in the enemy's head. At this moment, 2 more swords pierced his back. Although Shea's body had been strengthened by dragon blood, the strengthening of dragon blood had a limit. Once he was injured and his defense was broken, he would lose blood. His aura would rapidly decline, and the effect of dragon blood would immediately weaken. The 2 swords on his back also pierced Shea's flesh. Although they did not pierce through him, they directly pierced him and caused him to fall forward. At this moment, at the foot of the mountain, Kevin led the cavalry and circled around. He saw Shea rushing into the enemy's archers' formation. With a flurry of slashes, the enemy's archers were suddenly thrown into chaos and had no time to shoot. Then, he saw Shea being cut on the shoulder by a sword and kneeling down. The archers behind him swarmed forward and slashed down with their swords and sabers. Kevin could only watch with his eyes wide open. He screamed in pain and wanted to turn his horse around and charge forward. However, he suddenly saw Shea jumping up from the crowd. He fiercely knocked away several archers and shouted at the foot of the mountain, "F***ck your mother! Get lost!" Chapter 70. Shea's hoarse roar could be heard from afar. Kevin's face contorted and his eyes spat fire. He glared at the top of the mountain and finally shouted, "Lao Tzu will avenge you!" He then leaned on his horse's back and kicked the horse's belly as hard as he could, leading the cavalry towards the north. Shea could feel the blood flowing out of his body and his strength draining away bit by bit. The feeling of exhaustion washed over him like a tidal wave. There was still a sword embedded in his shoulder. His halberd had been slashed by the enemy archers many times and the handle of the halberd had broken. Shea flew up and kicked an archer in front of him, before ruthlessly stabbing the halberd into his chest. The sharp halberd broke through the armor and fresh blood sprayed onto Shea's face. The warm and pungent smell even made Shea feel a trace of saltiness at the corner of his mouth. At this moment, he had already killed more than 10 archers. These archers were poles apart from the legendary Odin. Every one of them was equipped with light armor of superior quality. This kind of armor removed the shoulder pads and didn't hinder the archer's agility when shooting. It only had armor plates installed on the vital parts. At the same time, every archer was equipped with the same short sword for close combat. It was obviously not something that the barbaric Odin could make. But after all, Shea was injured, and his defense had dropped to the lowest point. He clearly felt that the last sword strike he received was just an ordinary archer's attack, but the sword edge had almost cut off the bones of his calf. Dragon blood. Sure enough, it can only defend against ordinary attack. Once the defense is broken, its effectiveness will quickly diminish. The flaming trident continued to stab, displaying the annihilation of 1,000 armies move. The flaming trident seemed to leave behind afterimages as it stabbed another 3 archers to death. Shea was tightly surrounded, with enemies all around him. At this moment, the reindeer cavalry at the foot of the mountain saw that they couldn't catch up to Kevin's formation and urged their horses to surround them, running up the only slope of the mountain. Shea's heart was already filled with despair. Now that he was in a hopeless situation, his brute courage gradually calmed down along with his serious injuries. Damn it, I was too hot-headed just now and only cared about showing off. This time, Lao Tzu is dead for sure. Fuck me. I'm still a virgin. The reindeer cavalry had already charged up the hill. Following a roar, the archers moved aside when they heard the sound of hooves. A reindeer cavalry soldier quickly rushed over. From his appearance, it was clear that he was the leader of the reindeer cavalry. He wore a set of fine armor and a thick leather robe. However, his face was covered in blood, so his original appearance and age couldn't be seen. His eyes were filled with killing intent as he stared at Shea, who was already unstable on his feet. He suddenly rushed forward and chopped down on Shea's neck with his axe. Ding! When the edge of the axe was still 3 centimeters away from Shea's neck, the Odin warrior suddenly felt his axe become sluggish. It was as if the axe was being held in place by something viscous, and was unable to move forward any further. On Shea's neck, right in the middle of his throat, a red light suddenly burst out. That red light came from Shea's lapel. In an instant, the red light shone brightly and was incomparably dazzling. The lapel below Shea's neck split open, and a red crystal was exposed to the air. The red light instantly rolled out, and not only was Shea enveloped within it, even the area 10 steps around him was completely covered by the red light. Shea's eyes were completely red, and he could only feel the red light washing over his body. In an instant, all the pain in his body disappeared without a trace. In his mind, countless strange thoughts flooded in, and in an instant, forcefully filled his consciousness. Stab. Chop. Chop. Flick. In an instant, a complete set of moves capable of annihilating an army of 1,000 flashed through his mind. Every movement, every move became clear and natural. Some of the things that he had been unable to comprehend in the past suddenly became clear, as though the fog had been stripped away. The countless thoughts within his mind finally transformed into a single thought: kill! He suddenly let out a roar and jumped up. In just an instant, Shea was able to clearly see the faces of the enemies around him. Ferocious expressions, eyes filled with killing intent, facial muscles contorted. Then there were the movements of the enemies. Every twist and turn, every movement became clear and slow. Every shout and roar seemed to elongate and become distorted, and yet, his own consciousness remained as clear as ever. Kill! Kill them all! Kill them all! Wherever the red light enveloped, everything around him seemed to have become slow and clear. Shea made his move. The flaming fork was brandished horizontally in the midst of the red light. The red light seemed to have transformed into a thin blade of light as it flew out, piercing into the chest of the Odin reindeer cavalryman. Then, everything seemed to have slowed down by 10 times. Shea could clearly see the leather armor on the man's chest split open, followed by the muscles, the bones, the internal organs. Bit by bit, the man's entire upper body was cut into two from the chest. It was not just the man in front of him. 3 to 5 steps behind him, 2 reindeer cavalrymen had also strangely fallen. Their upper bodies were completely severed. Then, there was another one behind around Shea. The flaming fork slashed out in a circular arc. The 10+ archers who were surrounding him had their leather armor split open, their bowstrings broken, their skulls, bones, blood. It was as though the red light blade was able to easily cut through everything in front of it. Everything within 10 steps was dyed red. Crimson killing intent. This thought emerged in Shea's mind. The last time the scarlet murderous aura erupted, Shea was still unconscious, but this time, he could clearly feel every detail of the scarlet murderous aura's eruption. Wherever the crimson light enveloped, there seemed to be an indescribable magic. When he brandished his flaming fork, it seemed as though everything, no matter how sturdy the armor, or how sturdy the sword, they were all like air, easily sliced through without any obstruction. Wherever the crimson light went, defenses were ignored. The 10+ archers around him were all cut into two in an instant. Every one of them was easily dismembered. Even when their bodies were dismembered, half of their bodies were still standing there, with blood spurting out from the wounds. In front of Shea, to his left and right, within 10 steps, there was not a single living person. Such a shocking scene caused the enemy troops behind him to fall into a deathly silence. They were momentarily stunned, and their minds were completely blank. It was as though in the blink of an eye, so many of them had died. Shea let out a low roar and leapt forward. His feet left several cracks on the ground, and even the stones beneath his feet were shattered. His body leapt several meters into the air before finally landing on the back of a reindeer. He pushed the corpse off the reindeer's back and viciously stabbed his flaming fork into the reindeer's buttock. The reindeer immediately cried out miserably and raised its head to slam into the crowd of archers. Before the archers could recover from their shock, Shea had already rushed over. The reindeer was in pain, and its majestic body suddenly knocked away several archers. It threw itself to the side of the hillside, spreading its hooves, and leaped down. When the reindeer landed on the 4 to 5 meter hill, its 4 hooves were crushed by the force of the fall. Cried out miserably and fell to the ground. Shea rolled down from the reindeer's back and rolled a few times on the ground before suddenly taking large strides and running forward in a sorry state. At this moment, the Odin on the hill finally recovered from his shock. A few reindeer cavalry soldiers at the back of the formation saw their fallen comrades, especially the leader who had tried to chop Shea to death. He had already been split into 2 halves, the Odin soldiers simultaneously let out a frenzied roar. "That bastard killed the young highness! The young highness is dead!" The remaining reindeer warriors seemed to have collectively fallen into a frenzy. Everyone crazily turned their reindeer heads around and madly chased down the hill. Shea ran with all his might. His physique was strong, and every step he took was a few steps away from a normal person. Hearing the sound of reindeer hooves chasing after him, the Odin soldiers cried out and raised their weapons as they chased after him like a whirlwind. As Shea ran, he frantically searched his chest and finally found a small ring. "Damn, I'm counting on you. Don't disappoint, Lao Tzu." This ring was the wind magic ring that he had taken from the dead mage when he was slaying the dragon. Shea had once asked Todoro about it. This type of magic equipment wasn't limited to mages. As long as one was a human, they could use it after wearing it. However, there was a limit to the amount of magic added to the ring. Without a mage continuously pouring magic into it, it would become a consumable item. Once the magic was depleted, it would be no different from a normal ring. Once Shea put the ring on his finger, he immediately felt a strange energy fluctuation spread throughout his body. This fluctuation was gentle and slow, but it was as if the surrounding air had changed. Becoming viscous and light, Shea frantically took large strides. The first few steps were no different, but as he ran faster and faster, it was as if he could walk on air with every step he took. It was as if the air had become viscous and solid. When his feet landed on it, he could use it to run. At the same time, because of the ring, Shea clearly felt his body weight lighten, and his running speed increased greatly. As for what the Odin soldiers were shouting behind him, Shea couldn't understand a single word. However, looking at the crazed and murderous expressions on their faces, it probably wasn't anything good. The Odins in the back did their best to chase after him, but they only saw the guy in front of them running a few steps before dashing through the air. It was as if he was flying, and his figure rose and fell a few times before leaving them far behind. Chapter 71. Shea madly rushed towards the north. He didn't know how far he had run in one breath until the pursuers behind him were gradually getting further away. Finally, he couldn't even hear the battle cries anymore. Only then did he feel slightly relieved. Fortunately, the magic in the ring hadn't been used up. Since he had shaken off the pursuers, Shea couldn't bear to use the ring again. He took it off and carefully put it away. This kind of good thing should be used sparingly. Once he stopped, Shea found a low-lying pit and lay down. He stretched out his limbs and stuck out his tongue as he desperately gasped for breath. Although he had the help of the wind magic ring, Shea had also used all his strength to run. Otherwise, if he had been caught, he would have been dismembered. Now that he had stopped, he felt as if his lungs were on fire. He was gasping so hard that his windpipe was about to explode. Lying in the pit, Shea was so tired that he couldn't even move his fingers. This state lasted for about the time it took to eat a meal before he could stand up with difficulty. Once again, he experienced the crimson killing intent. When the crimson light enveloped his body, just like last time, all the injuries on Shea's body disappeared in an instant. The injuries caused by the repeated attacks were instantly healed by the crimson light. Even his shoulder had been cut by a sword, his armor had been cut open, and his fighting aura had exploded. Originally, his shoulder had been blasted into a bloody mess, and even his bones had been broken. But now, when he touched it, it had healed rapidly. Only the flesh and blood where the original wound had been was slightly red. Shea held his head and thought for a while. Damn, this is simply a unique skill. Healing injuries in an instant, and even releasing a killing move that ignores defense. If such a unique skill was used, wouldn't I be invincible? Shea held this crystal in his palm. He only felt that its surface had returned to its gray appearance. Only, there seemed to be a slight difference. Moving closer to take a closer look, it was indeed so. The surface of the crystal was still gray like an ordinary stone. But upon closer inspection, there seemed to be a small number of fine red lines on the surface of the crystal. The red lines were thinner than hair, and were sparsely distributed on the surface of the crystal. There weren't many of them either. It was as if, just like a person who hadn't slept for a long time, the veins on his eyes would appear. Only, the number was much smaller, and the size of the veins were also smaller. If one didn't look closely, they wouldn't be able to see it at all. He remembered that when he had looked at this stone before, it didn't have such a strange change. Could it be that he had accidentally used this strange red light twice, causing the change in the stone? Then, if he used it a few times in the future, would this stone turn pure red? Use it a few times, but Shea couldn't help but laugh. The red light had saved him twice, but he didn't know how to use it properly. Although the last killing move was powerful, it wasn't something that he could easily trigger. This method was too dangerous. If he were to encounter such a dangerous situation again, and the stone didn't emit red's light, wouldn't he die in vain? After resting for a while, Shea recovered some of his strength. Even though his hands and feet were still sore, but his physique was inhumanly strong. After a while, he recovered about 20 to 30% of his strength. He stood up and looked at his surroundings. After identifying the direction, he decided to continue heading north. Even though it was safest to head south and meet up with General Adric's troops, the reindeer cavalry was still chasing after him. If he headed south, he would meet up with Odin's troops before meeting up with them. He couldn't count on this Reds to save him again. He could only head north and catch up with Kevin and the others. Kevin, that bald guy, they should have already met up with the third emblem group. Just as Shea was heading north, Kevin had indeed met up with the third emblem group in the northern part of the Albacete Plains. Kevin led 300 cavalrymen and left the battlefield under Shea's protection. They continued their journey north. Along the way, they met with another group of reindeer cavalrymen. After forcefully breaking through the blockade, there were only about 200 cavalrymen left. When it was almost noon, Kevin finally met up with the third emblem group led by the silver-haired butler. The third emblem group was a light cavalry unit under the 13th Cavalry Division. When Kevin arrived, the third emblem group had already fallen into a difficult situation. This was a special terrain. There were forests on both sides of the mountain. Even though the slope wasn't high, only about 4 to 5 meters, it wasn't suitable for cavalry to fight. In the middle of the slope, there was a flat terrain that was about 200 to 300 meters wide. Such a flat terrain was too narrow. Odin's troops only needed to use a small number of infantrymen to form a thick formation in the narrow terrain, and it was enough to prevent the cavalrymen from charging head-on. After all, the third emblem group wasn't made up of heavy infantrymen. Charging head-on into the enemy's thick formation wasn't their forte. When Kevin arrived, the third emblem group had already fallen into a bitter battle. Flag-bearer Butler gathered his troops on a hillside and used the narrow path to defend while waiting for reinforcements. They had already been fighting hard for a night. The third emblem group had suffered heavy losses. Out of the original 2,000, only about 1,300 cavalrymen were left. Almost half of them were injured. Butler was so regretful that his intestines almost turned green. He was originally just a vanguard to conduct a search and clear the path for the main force behind. But last night, he met a small group of Odin's reindeer cavalrymen. After exchanging blows with them, Odin's men left more than 100 corpses behind and retreated. Butler was eager to expand his victory and chased after them. At night, vision wasn't good. He was lured into this dangerous terrain by Odin's men. By the time he realized what was going on, it was too late to retreat. This was clearly a trap. Odin's men had planned to take down the third emblem group that was acting as the vanguard in one gulp. In the narrow terrain, the cavalrymen couldn't charge out. Butler immediately made the decision to retreat to a hillside. When the sun rose, he finally confirmed that there was an entire regiment of Odin's men surrounding him. There were about 20,000 Odin's troops, and they had completely surrounded the hillside. Butler tried to lead his men to break out of the encirclement. After 2 attempts, the cavalrymen rushed down from the hillside and used the momentum of their charge to force the Odin's men at the foot of the hill to retreat. However, Odin's men had gathered too many troops. In this narrow terrain, as long as they formed a thick infantry formation, Butler, who only had about 1,000 cavalrymen, couldn't penetrate the enemy's camp. It was like a rusty blunt knife that couldn't pierce through thick meat. In the 2 attempts to break out of the encirclement, the cavalrymen of the 13th Corps fought bravely. However, after charging left and right, they were forced to retreat to the hillside in the end. If they had retreated a little later, they wouldn't even have had the chance to retreat to the hillside and would have been surrounded on the battlefield. When Kevin arrived with his men and saw the densely packed Odin's troops at the foot of the hill, his scalp went numb. He only had 200 cavalrymen left. It was really difficult for him to rush over and rescue his men. If 200 people rushed into a formation of 20,000 people, they would probably be wiped out in no time. However, Kevin soon discovered a strange phenomenon. The moment his 200 cavalrymen entered this area, they were quickly discovered. Butler, who was on the hillside, saw that the reinforcements had arrived. He gathered all his forces and organized another attempt to break out of the encirclement. The 1,000 cavalrymen under him charged down the hillside with their lives on the line. They actually managed to kill their way through the blockade of Odin's men. In the narrow terrain at the foot of the hill there were corpses everywhere. Odin's men surged up like a tide, and wherever Butler led his cavalrymen to charge, Odin's men would retreat like a tide. In this situation, Kevin had no other choice. He could only brace himself and lead his men to provide support. Along the way, they charged into Odin's formation. Although it was a bitter battle, Kevin still had doubts in his heart. The resistance of these Odin's men was far from as strong as he had imagined. The 2 armies quickly converged on the battlefield. Then, they attempted to quickly leave the battlefield and retreat to the south to meet up with the main force. The battle cries of tens of thousands of people shook the sky. They were squeezed in this narrow, flat, and low-lying terrain. When the 2 cavalrymen converged together, a muffled sound of a horn suddenly came from the hillside in the distance. The sound of the horn was deep and solemn. The Odin's soldiers who were still trying to tangle with the cavalrymen immediately retreated to the sides like a tide. They quickly broke away from contact with the Byzantium cavalrymen. They let us go? Kevin had doubts in his heart. At this moment, the flag-bearer of the 3rd emblem group, Butler, was covered in blood. His armor was damaged in at least 7 to 8 places. There was an arrow stuck in his shoulder, and his helmet was long gone. He met up with Kevin. Seeing the Odin's men retreating, the silver-haired man wiped the blood off his face. Suddenly, his expression changed. "Oh no, we've been tricked." Odin's infantry quickly retreated. Groups of reindeer cavalrymen rushed out from the forest on both sides of the hill. These reindeer cavalrymen had already rested for an entire night in the forest. Seeing the groups of reindeer cavalrymen crazily rushing down from the hillside, Butler's eyes flashed with a hint of desperation as he roared, "Charge south! Everyone charge south! Charge out of this canyon!" But it was already too late. The reindeer cavalrymen on both sides borrowed the momentum of the downhill slope to quickly entangle with the Byzantium cavalrymen. They were tightly biting onto their rear. Entanglement. Odin's tactic was very simple. It was to tightly bite onto the Byzantium cavalrymen and not give them a chance to breathe. After breaking out of the encirclement, the Byzantium cavalrymen's formation was completely messed up. In a situation where they were retreating while fighting, they were unable to find a chance to stop and form a formation to counterattack. Just like this, 1,000 cavalrymen were chased by the Odin's reindeer cavalrymen. In front of them, they were still breaking through layer after layer of infantry, and there were still arrows from the archers on the hillside. Kevin had never fought such a cowardly battle before. He was clear that if it was a direct confrontation, as the Byzantine Empire's most elite cavalrymen, they would definitely be able to crush the Odin's reindeer cavalrymen. But they couldn't turn around. They couldn't turn around. In order for the cavalrymen to effectively kill, they had to form a formation and charge. They were being chased by the enemy in the midst of the chaos and didn't have a chance to catch their breath. If they stopped, a large number of Odin's infantry would surround them. If they didn't stop, they wouldn't be able to shake off the reindeer cavalrymen behind them. The reindeer cavalrymen behind them were like a knife, slicing through the Byzantium cavalrymen's formation layer by layer. On a hillside in the distance, under a large cowhide cloak, a tall figure stood there. Behind him was a large chair made from the bones of some kind of beast, covered with a thick layer of black fur. This person had the typical tall build of the Odin's people. His shoulders were wide, and his body was filled with explosive strength. He wore a bear helmet on his head, and under the gray fur cloak, he didn't have any weapons in his hands. Instead, he held a small flag. Compared to the rough skin of ordinary Odin's people, this person's skin was excessively white, as if he had a sickly appearance. A pair of dark green eyes, rarely seen among the Odin's people, were staring at the battle in the distance. Behind him, there were dozens of tall Odin's soldiers. Every one of them was over 2 meters tall. These Odin's soldiers all wore thick bear pelts, with only metal armor hanging in front of their chests. They held short axes in their hands, and every Odin's soldier had their hair woven into small whips. With such attire, they were the famous axe soldiers of the Odin's people. The Odin's soldier wearing a bear helmet withdrew his gaze and revealed a faint smile of disdain. Humph, the famous Rhodian cavalry regiment is only so. He smiled faintly and suddenly stretched out his arm. On his arm there was a black metal ring. A loud eagle cry sounded in the air, and a gray feathered eagle landed on his arm. The Odin's soldier stretched out his finger and lightly tapped the eagle's head. Then, he took out a bloody piece of meat from his pocket and placed it under the eagle's beak. Oh! Adrik should have brought people over. His eyes flashed with a trace of a proud smile, but before his smile could fully blossom, he heard the sound of galloping horses behind him. A reindeer cavalryman quickly rushed over 10 meters away and jumped down. He staggered forward and crawled on the ground. What's wrong? The Odin's soldier frowned. The reindeer cavalryman was a burly Odin's man. At this moment, his face was filled with fear and his body trembled. Honorable Lady Cuchulainn, your brother. Cuchulainn raised her eyebrows. What happened to him? Your brother died in battle. He died in the hands of a Byzantium cavalry. We tried to kill the murderer, but... As he spoke, the Odin's soldier shut his mouth. This was because he saw Cuchulainn's gaze on his face. Cuchulainn's gaze was incomparably sharp and instantly exploded with a chilling light. The reindeer cavalryman's body trembled uncontrollably. Thinking that such an important person had died in battle in his own army, he was afraid. Just as the cavalryman's heart was filled with fear, the thunderous fury that he expected did not descend. Cuchulainn seemed to be silent for a moment. Then, a strange smile appeared on her face. Oh, my dear younger brother, he died in battle? Oh, this is interesting news. For us Odin warriors, dying in battle is a rare honor. These 2 sentences were said without a trace of anger. In fact, there was even a hint of gentleness in her tone. However, because of this, the cavalryman who was familiar with Lady Cuchulainn's temperament felt a chill in his heart. Seeing Lady Cuchulainn's gaze become gentler and gentler, the cavalryman crawled on the ground and did not even dare to raise his head. His body trembled as if he had caught a cold. Cuchulainn had a smile on her face as she casually used her fingers to tease the winged eagle on her arm. She seemed to be talking to herself. One of his sons has died. I'm sure my honorable and great father will be furious. Sigh, this is such sad news. Although he said that, the warm smile on his face did not have the slightest bit of sadness. Fortunately, my father has more than 20 sons. 1 or 2 of them dying is not a big deal. The last sentence was even more rebellious. The cavalryman wished that he could turn deaf at this moment. If he heard such rebellious words, Lady Cuchulainn would definitely not let him off. Finally, after a moment of silence, Cuchulainn took a deep breath. The warm smile on her face disappeared and was replaced with a stern expression. Pass down my orders! Raise the blood-red flag. I want to avenge my dear brother. Then, write a letter back and report this sad news. After a pause, a strange look flashed in her eyes. No matter what, one of my brothers has died. I have to do something. This is the first time I'm personally leading an army. I can't mess this up. Kevin and Butler finally brought their men out of the low-lying area. After running out of the valley, there was an open area in front of them. The 2 of them were already covered in injuries. Kevin had already thrown away his warhammer on the battlefield. Right now, he was holding a double-edged knight's sword. Butler was lying on the back of his horse. This silver-haired man could not even straighten his body. An Odin reindeer cavalryman had chopped at his back with an axe. His armor had been split open, and that axe had almost taken his life. Once they charged out of the valley, Kevin's heart trembled. Without the Odin infantrymen in front of them, they could rely on the speed of their cavalrymen to outrun the reindeer cavalrymen. As long as they could regroup, they would be able to launch a counterattack. This way, they would be able to let the Odin reindeer cavalrymen have a taste of the might of the Byzantium cavalrymen. Cavalrymen had always been the Byzantium cavalrymen's strongest troop type. Kevin, who was previously restrained, wanted to vent his anger. However, what made him furious was that once they charged out of the valley, the Odin reindeer cavalrymen behind them immediately stopped their pursuit. The vanguard quickly separated from the Byzantium cavalrymen and retreated back into the valley. These bastards! When did the Odin cavalrymen become so cunning? When they finally stopped to form up, Butler and Kevin vomited blood on the spot when they did a head count. The 3rd emblem group and Kevin's reinforcements added up to less than 600 cavalrymen who had made it out alive. This meant that the enemy's tactic of chasing and attacking might seem cunning and unreasonable, but it was very effective. This tactic of entanglement had caused more than half of the Byzantium cavalrymen to die. The 3rd emblem group was completely crippled in this battle. In the following battles, they could no longer rely on an emblem group to fight. They could only wait for the battle to be rebuilt. Butler's heart was bleeding. As the commander of the 3rd emblem group, these cavalrymen were all trained by him. How could he not grieve over the loss of more than 70% of his troops? It could be said that if the Odin cavalrymen's plan was to wipe out the 3rd emblem group, then this battle objective was basically completed. Out of the 2,000 cavalrymen in the 3rd emblem group, less than 500 were still alive. They had lost 70% of their men. Even if they brought along all the survivors, there were only 300 who could still fight. Although the 3rd emblem group was not completely wiped out in this battle, they had basically lost their ability to fight. Butler, the silver-haired man, no longer had a trace of heroism on his face. It was as if he had aged 20 years. He leaned on the horse's back, blood flowing out from the corner of his mouth as he clenched his teeth tightly. Kevin's heart was bleeding as he looked at the remaining soldiers beside him. This is not normal. The battle style of these Odin cavalrymen is poles apart from the past. In the past, the Odin cavalrymen were the symbol of savagery and bravery. They were the best at fighting head-on battles. They would never use such cunning tactics like luring the enemy, ambushing them, besieging them to attack reinforcements, and pestering them to death. Other than that, the most important point that Kevin and Butler could not take to heart was, Although there were about 20,000 Odin cavalrymen in front of them, judging from their quality, they were not the elite troops of the Odin cavalrymen. They were just an ordinary army of the Odin cavalrymen. Regardless of individual quality or combat strength, they were far from the standard of the Odin cavalrymen's elite troops. In the past, the 13th Cavalry Division had suffered great losses in the hands of the Odin cavalrymen. However, they had lost to the elite troops of the Odin cavalrymen under the command of Hastings. However, this time, they had suffered such a huge blow in front of an ordinary army of the Odin cavalrymen. The two of them were veterans who had been in the army for a long time. They could roughly estimate that the losses of the Odin cavalrymen this time were around 3,000 to 4,000. Looking at the ratio of losses on both sides, it didn't seem too bad. However, don't forget that their side was one of the most elite troops of the Byzantine Empire. Moreover, they were all powerful troops, cavalrymen. Motherfucker, the Odin cavalrymen actually know how to use the terrain and strategy. Could it be that the enemy's general is Hastings? Kevin fiercely spat out a mouthful of blood. No. Butler's face was pale. It's not like we haven't encountered Hastings' Black Flag cavalrymen before. If there was a change in general, then with Hastings' prestige in the Odin Empire, he would definitely not be demoted to command an ordinary army. The only explanation is that a formidable general has appeared among the Odin cavalrymen. Pausing for a moment, although this veteran was shaken by the blow, he still gritted his teeth and gave the order. Since those Odin cavalrymen didn't pursue, then his side didn't need to immediately retreat. They took up defensive positions on the spot, and at the same time sent out messengers to wait for the main force behind to arrive. When the general arrives with his men, we will have a fierce battle with those Odins. Shea didn't dare to walk on the main road. It was as if he had returned to the days when he hunted alone in the wilderness. He carefully sneaked through the complicated mountain slopes, purposely taking a huge detour from the right side for more than 10 li, quietly approaching the predetermined rendezvous point. When it was almost noon, Shea finally arrived at this mountain valley. But very coincidentally, because he didn't walk on the main road, he didn't encounter Kevin and the others who were waiting for reinforcements at the south side of the mountain valley. Instead, he took a detour from the right side and quickly approached the mountain slope on the right side. When he approached the forest, Shea immediately heard sounds from behind him. Based on his experience, the muffled and disorderly hoofbeats clearly didn't belong to the Byzantine Empire's cavalry. He immediately scurried up a tree like a monkey, and saw a small troop of reindeer cavalry slowly passing by below. After clearly seeing the number of enemies, Shea didn't even dare to breathe loudly, afraid that he would reveal the slightest trace of movement. Afterwards, he crouched down on the tree trunk and quietly curled his body into a ball. He heard a clamor from the forest, and squad after squad of Odin cavalrymen marched out from the forest and lined up outside the forest. Chapter 72. Shea regretted his decision to go in this direction. Seeing the Odin soldiers beginning to line up, he immediately retreated carefully. Using his own agile skills, he silently climbed the tree trunk. His movements were like a vigorous lynx, bending his body like a cat, climbing from one tree to another. This process was very slow, and each of his movements was as light as possible. Until he climbed more than 10 trees and entered deep into the forest, far away from the group of Odin soldiers, Shea reluctantly increased his speed, heading into the forest. But soon, in the depths of the forest, a small group of Icefield hunters appeared. Suddenly, Shea's heart jumped to his throat. These guys were sharp enough to pose a threat to Shea's hiding place. He immediately stopped moving, and found himself on a forked branch of a big tree. With his keen eyes, Shea vaguely saw a group of majestic Odin soldiers coming over. These Odin soldiers, compared to the ones he had encountered, were taller and more burly. Each of them looked very capable, wearing animal skins and carrying short axes. These guys all looked indifferent, and their eyes hid a hint of violence. However, they just stood there quietly in a circle. The most frightening thing was that there were more and more Odin soldiers gathering below. In addition to the Icefield hunters, there were more than 10 Odin soldiers wearing strange animal skins. These guys did not carry weapons, but they wore all kinds of strange animal bones on their bodies. One of them was an old Odin soldier, thin and tall, with a head full of scattered hair. He wore a wide leather robe, but under the robe was unexpectedly naked. This Odin soldier seemed to have the highest status among all the Odin soldiers. The other Odin soldiers kept a considerable distance from him, maintaining a respectful posture from afar. Soon, a fire was lit on the ground. The thin Odin soldier grabbed a handful of unknown powder from the leather bag he carried and threw it into the fire. The fire immediately turned into a strange green, burning fiercely. This guy sprinkled the powder while his mouth began to chant strange note. Because Shea did not understand the Odin language, he could not understand the other party's words. However, with this Odin soldier's chanting, all the surrounding Odin soldiers knelt down and crawled around the green fire. A strange feeling was born in Shea's heart. This Odin soldier, could it be a magician? No, I heard that the Odin soldiers were not called magicians, but priests? The Odin soldiers at the back quickly carried over 2 wild animals, a living wolf and even a living grizzly bear. These animals were originally tied up and thrown next to the fire. They were still howling and baring their teeth. However, this Odin priest walked over with a strange smile on his thin face. He first reached out his hand to touch the wolf. The wolf immediately seemed to be terrified to the extreme and did not even dare to struggle. It shrunk its head and howled pitifully. With a bitter smile on his face, the shaman gently placed his hand on the wolf's head. His fingers were like dried branches as they pressed on the wolf's head. Then, as his chanting became stranger and stranger, the wolf's howls gradually became softer. As the priest's fingers gently pinched, Shea's eyes widened as he saw a strange scene. Above the wolf's head, a transparent light was gently pulled out by the priest from the wolf's head. The light was very weak. As the light was pulled out of the wolf's body, the wolf suddenly stopped moving and became stiff. Suddenly recalling the dragon-slaying experience, Shea's heart began to beat wildly. It was the soul. The shaman had actually extracted the wolf's soul from its body with a single flick of his hand. The priest's face was solemn. He held the light in his hand and gently threw it into the green flame with a bang. The green light shone brightly. From within the flame, a painful howl seemed to be heard. The priest used his finger to pull out the green flame and directly cut it out. In his hand, it turned into tens of green light dots. With a light flick of his finger, the tens of light dots shot towards the surrounding axe-wielding burly Odin soldiers. When the light dots landed on the chest or head of the Odin soldiers, the green light dots immediately entered their bodies. Next, each of the soldiers raised their heads and howled in pain. The faces of these Odin soldiers were filled with pain. The muscles on their faces were constantly contorted as they grimaced in pain. Some of them even had tears and snot flowing down their faces. It was as though they were in great pain. Next, some of them struggled to stand up. Their bodies were like wooden puppets as they wriggled about. Then, one by one, they tore off their leather robes, revealing their bare chests. Their muscles were visibly swelling, and the surface of their skin was quickly torn apart. However, new skin quickly healed the wounds and patches of thick black hair grew out from the surface of their skin. Even their faces were covered with thick hairs. It was as though half-wolf, half-human monsters. Everyone's originally cold eyes had turned into a strange green color. It was as though there were 2 green flames flickering within their eyes. Although their eyes were cold before, at least they still had human emotions. However, after turning into 2 green flames, it was as though there was no trace of humanity left. Burning the soul of a beast and injecting it into a human body, could it be? Shea's face changed dramatically. Could it be the legendary Beast Soul Warrior? He seemed to have heard some mercenaries bragging about their experiences in Wildfire Town's taverns. Someone had mentioned that there was a kind of extremely powerful Beast Soul Warrior in the Odin Empire. This kind of legendary Beast Soul Warrior was as fierce as a wild beast in battle. They had boundless strength, no fear, no pain, and extremely powerful fighting strength. It was as if they were possessed by a wild beast's soul power. These half-wolf warriors were roaring. The tall and thin priest Odin had already walked to the front of another gray bear. That bear bared its teeth and growled, but when the priest approached, the growl gradually turned into a mournful whine, as if it had sensed danger and despair. The priest seemed to have a smile on his face, but that smile was very strange. There was no joy in it at all, but a trace of cruelty. He pressed one hand on the bear's head, and as he chanted, his fingertips made a pulling motion. Soon, a green soul light was peeled out from the bear's head like silk being peeled out from a cocoon. Obviously, the capacity of this bear's soul light was much greater than the wolf's. A ball of light was thrown into the green flame, and the blazing flame suddenly became much more vigorous. The priest seemed to be a little tired. His forehead was full of sweat, and his face was pale. The tone of his chanting also became lower, and his breath was obviously hurried. Then he stretched out his hand, and his dry claw-like hand reached into the flame. With a gentle wave, the green light was separated. The priest's mana seemed to be unable to support the consumption. His palm shouldn't have been burned by the flame, but at this moment there was suddenly a sizzling smoke, and his palm was suddenly scorched. The priest frowned, as if he couldn't feel the pain, but he was still a little nervous. He quickly grabbed the green flame into his palm, and then quickly flicked his charcoal-like claws a few times. Behind him, a row of tall and burly Odin warriors walked out. These Odin warriors were full of excitement, as if they were full of anticipation for what was about to happen. This group of Odin warriors was the tallest among all the Odin warriors that Shea could see. Every one of them was at least 2 heads taller than Shea himself. Moreover, they were all wearing heavy and thick iron armor, and held long steel axes in their hand. More than 10 bear souls flames shot onto these guys, and soon, a loud and clear roar was heard. More than 10 Odin warriors roared towards the sky, and vigorously beat their chests. Their muscles quickly swelled, and some of them even grew taller in an instant. The expansion of their bodies caused the iron armor on their bodies to be distorted, and made cracking sound. These guys didn't seem to feel pain, and only roared like wild beasts. Finally, they felt the restraint of their armor, and directly stretched out their hands that had turned into giant claws to tear at the armor. The originally thick iron armor was as fragile as paper in their hands, and with a light tug, it was torn apart. On the tree, Shea's heart was beating wildly when he saw this. What powerful strength! At least Shea himself was very clear. Although he was known for his strength, if he wanted to tear apart iron armor with his bare hands, he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to do it. At least these Odin monsters could easily pierce through iron armor with their fingers, and then tear it apart. His own fingers weren't that hard. Even if they were strengthened by dragon blood, he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to do it. Damn, as hard as iron. These Odin monsters' hands were as hard as iron. Look at their muscles, their arms had swelled up to be thicker than his thighs. Their naked parts were covered with long black hair, and their mouths were rapidly growing sharp canines and fangs. Were these guys still human? Shea's heart was beating wildly. He was very clear that he had accidentally stumbled upon some kind of magic ritual that the Odin priests used to create beast soul berserkers. Below him were all these terrifying half-human half-beast monsters, and their terrifying strength that could tear apart iron armor with their bare hands. Once he was discovered, he would definitely die. No, he would definitely die. No matter how bold a country bumpkin was, under such circumstances, it was inevitable that his heart would beat like a drum, and he would feel a chill run down his spine. He subconsciously held his breath, and carefully hid in the tree branch, not daring to move an inch. But at this time, the ritual below continued, and Shea's face suddenly changed. Obviously, the ritual was not over yet. Dozens of beast soul warriors that had just gone berserk were crawling on the ground in front of the priest, growling in a low voice. The priest had refined 2 beast souls in a row, and seemed to be very tired. Next to him, an Odin wearing a leather robe, like the priest's assistant, walked over and said a few words of concern. The skinny priest closed his eyes, wiped the sweat off his forehead, and shook his head. Then he opened his eyes and said a few words in a very determined manner. Soon, a few more guys were tied up from the forest, but this time, when Shea saw it from the tree, his eyes immediately turned red. This time, it wasn't beasts that were tied up, but people. A few injured Byzantium cavalrymen were tied up and carried up. The blood on their bodies hadn't dried yet, and it was obvious that they had been captured not long ago. What made Shea even more shocked was that there were people he knew among them. The one tied up at the front was a tall and sturdy man about the same size as Odin. This kind of physique was considered rare among the Byzantium people. This guy's robe was cut in several places, and blood was still flowing. When he was carried up, he was cursing loudly. Shea immediately recognized him. This was Sharba, his comrade in the personal guard. He was the former number 1 strongman of the personal guard, and he had wrestled with him before. In the personal guard camp, other than Kevin and that cunning Ka-Tua, this boorish man was the one who got along with him the most. This time, he had accompanied Kevin and himself to the north to rescue Butler, but why was he captured here? Could it be that Kevin and the rest had been defeated? Shea was somewhat anxious. Sharba was cursing loudly. Although he knew that most of the Odin's people wouldn't understand, he still continued to curse. As for the second person tied up, Shea recognized him even more. It was Ka-Tua. It was that cunning Ka-Tua. That Ka-Tua who had secretly given him a bottle of wine on the first day he entered the camp. Chapter 73. Apart from the bald man Kevin, this brute Sharba and the crafty Ka-Tua were his 2 best friends in the personal guard. Looking at the 2 tied up on the spot, Sharba's injuries weren't too serious, but Ka-Tua's injuries were even more serious. An arrow had pierced through his chest, and his left arm was dangling weakly. It was obvious that it had been cut, but no one knew if it was broken or not. Behind the 2 were several cavalrymen. Judging from their attire, they weren't part of the personal guard, but were probably Butler's subordinates. Shea immediately became anxious, his heart beating wildly like a drum. Seeing Sharba and Ka-Tua tied up in front of the shaman, the Odin's men immediately kicked them down to kneel on the ground. Sharba still wanted to resist, but after being kicked a few times, he finally knelt down. The shriveled shaman stood in front of the captives and looked at them one by one. Then, he walked to the last Byzantium cavalryman. These cavalrymen of the 13th Corps were all tough men. Not a single one of them begged for mercy. Their expressions were resolute as they coldly stared at the shaman. However, when the shaman let out a bitter laugh and took out something from a leather pouch at his waist, the captives' expressions finally changed. Even the most courageous of them all, Sharba, revealed a trace of disgust and fear in his eyes. It was a small worm that looked like an earthworm. Its entire body was silver, and it emitted traces of green radiance. It was about the length of a finger. The shaman carefully pinched the worm, then used his other hand to pinch the chin of the Byzantium cavalryman, forcing him to open his mouth. The cavalryman clenched his teeth tightly. One of the Odin's men beside him took out a dagger and ruthlessly stabbed him. The Byzantium cavalryman finally couldn't help but open his mouth in pain. Immediately, the shaman stuffed the worm into his mouth. The Byzantium cavalryman's expression changed drastically. His body stiffened, and a green mist came out of his nose. His entire face was covered in green gas. Soon after, the cavalryman closed his eyes and breathed his last. However, a bump suddenly appeared on his forehead. Something was wriggling under the bump. With a pop, his head was drilled open, and the dark green bug broke out of his head. Looking at the hole in his head, the cavalry soldier's entire head had been drilled through. The brain matter had completely disappeared, and the size of the bug had more than doubled. It was obvious that it had sucked the soldier's brain dry. The green light on its body became more and more intense, and its fat body began to swell. It wriggled a few times and was picked up by the shaman. The shaman held the fat bug in his hand with an excited and proud smile on his face. "Hey, Katua, you're more experienced than me. What the hell did this Odin guy do?" Sharba fiercely swallowed his saliva. "Fuck, it's fine if we're caught, but this guy..." Katuo's face was already pale, and he barely squeezed out a voice. "Hell, this is the Odin shaman, it's sucking our souls. We can't even die properly. Do you see that bug? It ate the human brain matter, and at the same time sucked in the soul. That's a soul-eating bug. Hell, we're done for." "Fuck." Sharba's face also changed. He suddenly roared angrily and struggled with all his might. "You son of a bitch Odin guy, pig, bastard, imbecile! If you have the guts, chop me up?" The Odin shaman lightly pinched the bug between his fingers, and then slowly walked to the side of the green fire. At this moment, the fire had already weakened a lot, and was about to go out. Although there were 2 Odin shamans adding firewood to the fire, they couldn't stop the green flames from dimming. The old shaman lightly tossed the brain-sucking bug into the fire. Instantly, the fire gushed out with a bang, as if it had new fuel. The raging flames even reached 3 to 4 meters high, and the color of the flames was horrifying. It was a wretched green. The shaman smiled with satisfaction, and then reached his hand into the fire to pinch it. When he retracted his finger, it was actually that bug. That bug burned in the fire, but it wasn't damaged in the slightest. Only its originally bloated body had become as thin as before, as if the soul it had sucked into its body had been directly burned by the fire. Yet, its body didn't fear fire. The shaman pinched the bug and walked to the front of another Byzantium captive. This time, in front of him was the first in line, Sharba. Shea's scalp was already numb from looking at it. Especially that weird bug that drilled into a person's mouth, sucked their brains clean, and finally broke out of the body. Its appearance was simply like a maggot, and one couldn't help but feel a chill down their spine. Shea was thoroughly shocked and couldn't recover his senses for a moment. But when the shaman pinched that disgusting bug out of the fire and approached Sharba, Shea abruptly reacted. In that instant, Shea's heart was in a state of internal conflict. 2 conflicting thoughts were constantly struggling. Go out? With so many Odin's men around, only death awaited him if he went down. Don't go out? The person below was his comrade, and a friend that he had acknowledged. A friend that he had tasted for the first time in his 18 years of life, the taste of friendship. For a moment, Shea's expression twisted. Finally, the corner of the country bumpkin's eyes twitched a few times. His fingers tightly gripped the fire fork, and he fiercely pulled on his belt. Then, he took a deep breath and threw himself down. Damn it! If I die, then I die. But watching my friend die in front of me without doing anything, this kind of cowardly action is not something that I, Shea, can do. Sharba's heart was already in despair. This brave man wasn't afraid of death, but when he thought about how his soul was going to be sucked away, he couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. He tightly closed his eyes and waited for death. But suddenly, he heard a roar from beside his ear. Raising his head, he saw a figure throwing himself down from the tree. His hair was disheveled, and he wore a tattered leather robe. His entire body was covered in dust and blood, and he threw himself down while screaming like a pig being slaughtered. If it wasn't Shea, who else could it be? Shea's appearance was like a heavenly soldier descending from the heavens. Instantly, Sharba and Ka-Tuo's expressions shook. Both of them were elite Byzantium soldiers. They immediately struggled to jump up, and at the same time, charged towards the Odin's men behind them. When Shea landed on the ground, he rolled and fiercely threw himself at the shaman. He was very clear in his heart that if he fought alone, only death would await him. His only chance of survival was to grab hold of this seemingly high-ranking shaman Odin. Shea's movements were very fast. With a leap, he was already in front of the shaman. He extended his hand towards the shaman to grab him. Suddenly, he heard a terrifying roar from beside him. A sense of danger instantly spread throughout his body. At this moment, Shea's hair stood on end. This feeling of danger made him instinctively shrink his head, and he fiercely threw himself to the ground. This action saved his life. With a whoosh, a huge claw swept across his head. Shea fell to the ground and quickly rolled forward. Just as he turned around, he saw a huge bear-like half-beast warrior in front of him, waving his huge palm. Shea had no choice but to use his flaming fork to block. With a caw sound, the sharp flaming fork cut the opponent's palm into two, and the broken palm flew out. However, Shea also snorted and retreated 3 steps. His fire fork wasn't damaged, but the palm between his thumb and forefinger that was holding the fire fork was shaken to the point of extreme pain. Even a barbarian with monstrous strength like Shea found it so strenuous. It could be seen how terrifying the strength of this bear soul warrior was. The other bear soul warriors also surrounded him. A few gray shadows flashed, and the wolf soul warriors behind them moved even faster. With a few leaps, they rushed in front of the bear soul warriors. What fast movements! Shea's scalp suddenly tightened. He raised his head and fell backwards. A wolf soul warrior brushed past his scalp and landed on the ground. Like a wolf, he supported himself on the ground with his 4 limbs. Then, he turned around and roared at Shea. "Son of a bitch, he is no longer human." Shea cursed in his heart. However, he felt a burning pain on his face. He wiped his hand and found that his hand was covered in blood. It turned out that the wolf soul warrior had brushed past him. Although its claws didn't cut him, the tip of its claws had cut his skin. Damn it, his body had been strengthened by dragon's blood. At this moment, the other wolf soul warriors also rushed over. Shea instantly made up his mind. "I'll go all out." He suddenly spread open his arms and forced one of the wolf soul warriors to meet it head-on. He actually used his chest to meet the wolf soul warrior's claws. Sharba and Kata were dumbfounded. Could it be that this rookie wants to die? He actually sold the vital part of his chest to the other party to attack? With a bang, Shea and the wolf soul warrior collided. The wolf soul warrior's claws stabbed into Shea's chest, but 2 clear breaking sounds could be heard. Shea threw the wolf soul warrior to the ground, and a thought flashed through his mind. The gamble paid off. Although the attacks of these fellows were powerful, they were still unable to pierce through the dragon's scales. On Shea's chest, there was a dragon's scale the size of a washbasin hidden close to his body as a shield. Another thing that Shea confirmed was that the wolf soul warriors were much weaker than the bear soul warriors. Only their movements were much more agile. In comparison, the wolf soul warriors were more like the enhanced version of the Icefield hunters. When Shea landed on the ground, his hands grabbed the wolf soul warrior. Taking advantage of the moment when the wolf soul warrior's claws were blocked by the dragon scales, Shea twisted his hands and snapped the wolf soul warrior's neck. He grabbed the corpse and turned around. Then, he ruthlessly smashed the corpse towards a bear soul warrior in front of him. The bear soul warrior staggered. After all, A country bumpkin's strength was not necessarily weaker than a bear soul warrior's. He smashed down with all his might, and the bear soul warrior immediately fell to the side. With a boom, he fell right into the blazing green bonfire. Suddenly, a mournful scream was heard. The bear soul warrior's body was covered in green flames, and he rolled on the ground. However, the green flames did not seem to be extinguished. Soon, the bear soul warrior's swollen body shriveled up, as if some kind of power in his body was rapidly being burned out. The other beast soul warriors immediately retreated in fear. Shea knew that these fellows were afraid of the green flames. At this moment, the skinny shaman had already run a dozen steps away. He shouted loudly and a noisy roar came from the distance. Large groups of Odin warriors rushed over from the forest. Shea turned around and quickly threw the flaming fork at the shaman. With a "pew" sound, the flaming fork directly pierced the shaman's thigh and nailed him to the ground. Shea quickly turned around and rushed forward. A wolf soul warrior behind him was forced to the front. With a "pew" sound, a piece of the shaman's armor was scratched off. Fortunately, the wolf soul warrior was much weaker. After being blocked by the armor, the wolf soul warrior only left a few deep scars on the shaman's back. Shea had already rushed to the shaman's side and pulled out the flaming fork. Ignoring the shaman's screams, Shea grabbed the shaman by the neck and lifted him up. With the flaming fork on the shaman's neck, Shea turned around and roared at the surrounding Odin warriors. "Whoever dares to come, Lao Tzu will kill him." Chapter 74. The Odin warriors who were running over from a distance suddenly stopped and shouted at Xiao with their swords and swords. But at this time, a strong wind whistled from the side, and a huge axe chopped down. Xiao was helpless, and could only block it with his fire fork. Kung! With a humming sound, the axe broke on the spot. Xiao felt as if he had been struck by lightning, and he almost couldn't lift his arm. Looking up, he saw a bear soul warrior standing beside him, holding a half-broken axe in his hand. Such strength! Shea grabbed the priest and retreated quickly. At the same time, he yelled at the priest, "Tell these monsters to stop." Then, he raised his fork and stabbed another hole in the priest's thigh. The old shaman finally screamed and roared a few times in Odin's language. The beast soul warriors suddenly seemed to have heard an order and all of them stopped. They only stared at Shea, green flames flickering in their eyes, and their mouths and nostrils huffing and puffing. Shea grabbed the priest's neck and quickly retreated to Sharba and Ka Tuo's side. He didn't care what the Odin's people were yelling. He couldn't understand them anyway. Shea raised his hand and used the fire fork to cut off the ox tendons on their bodies. The two of them immediately jumped up and surrounded Shea. Shea waved his hand and chopped off a branch and gave it to Sharba. Then, he used the branch to poke the green bonfire. Suddenly, one end of the branch ignited with green flames and turned into a green torch. Shea waved the green torch at the beast soul warriors. The beast soul warriors were obviously afraid of the green flame. They were forced to retreat a few steps. Shea and his two companions quickly retreated into the forest. They confronted the Odin's people and retreated at the same time. The Odin's people seemed to value the priest very much. They were also afraid of the priest's safety. Shea and the others quickly got out of the forest and came to the hillside. Behind them was a 4-meter-high hillside. "Jump down, quick!" Shea turned his head and shouted at Sharba. Sharba and Ka Tua looked at each other. They grabbed the priest and rolled down the hillside. The height of 4 or 5 meters was not too high, and the hillside was not too steep. When the two landed, Shea also came down, but the country bumpkin directly jumped down. At this moment, the Odin's people on the hillside had reached the edge of the hillside. When they saw Shea and the others jump down, they immediately shouted. Shea saw clearly that the opposite side was also a hillside. The flat terrain between the hillsides was only a few hundred meters wide. It had become a battlefield. The ground was full of corpses. Horses and reindeer left by the cavalry. There were also some Odin's soldiers who were cleaning up the battlefield. When they saw Shea and the others, they immediately surrounded them from all directions. Shea forced the priest to shout a few times. The Odin's people retreated far away, not daring to move forward. Looking to the south, the exit of the valley was only a few hundred meters away. Shea and the other two quickly ran south with the priest. The Odin's people chased after them. However, Shea would occasionally stab the priest twice, causing the Odin's people to be afraid and not chase too closely. The Beast Soul warriors were at the front. Shea still held the green torch in his hand. However, more than half of the branches had been burned, and the torch was getting shorter and shorter. At this moment, on the hillside, Cuchulainn looked at Shea and the others with a gloomy face. He had already received a report from his subordinate. Idiots! How could you let a hidden Byzantium person kidnap the priest? Cuchulainn's face no longer had that gentle expression. Instead, it was twisted with anger. His anger at this moment was much stronger than when he found out that his little brother had died in battle. One of the Odin's soldiers pointed at Shea and said something. Cuchulainn's eyes immediately lit up. Oh? This is the Byzantium warrior who killed my little brother? Ha! Interesting. The anger on Cuchulainn's face instantly vanished. He narrowed his eyes and looked at Shea, who was retreating in the distance. Suddenly, he laughed and turned around to take out a large bough which was half a person's height from behind the chair made of animal bones. The body of the bough was also white. It was unknown what kind of beast bone was used to make it. Both sides of the bough were inlaid with a milky white fist-sized gem. Cuchulainn gently pulled the bough. There was no arrow on the bowstring. He aimed at the distant Shea. Since Lord Priest cannot be saved, there is no need to save him. Rather than being captured by the Byzantium people, he might as well die here. Cuchulainn's voice was calm and the corners of his mouth curled into a sneer. Besides, the murderer of my little brother must be killed. Otherwise, how am I going to explain this to my beloved imperial father? 1. Shea was in the midst of retreating when he suddenly heard a strange wung sound. Raising his head, he saw a silver speck of light to his left. The speck of light quickly transformed into a clump of light. It grew bigger and bigger as it flew toward him. In an instant, a bone-piercing sense of danger enveloped his entire body. The light seemed to carry with it a sense of crisis that caused Shea to feel despair. He suddenly let out a loud roar and crazily swung his fiery fork to block the light. Bang! Shea's entire body flew backward and slammed heavily onto the ground. His right hand that was holding onto the flaming fork had several cracks on it and blood flowed out. Even a few of his fingers were broken. Good. So strong. Shea's heart sank to the bottom. Just an arrow shot from afar was able to easily destroy his body that had been strengthened by dragon's blood? Thankfully, the flaming fork remained undamaged. Katua quickly rushed over to help Shea up. However, Shea pushed him away and shouted, "Run! Run!" After saying that, he grabbed Katua and threw him to the south. And, to actually be able to block my arrow. This fellow is indeed a warrior who could kill my little brother. He is at least a middle-ranked warrior from Byzantium. The smile on Cuchulainn's pale face grew even more feminine and his fingers gripped the bowstring once more. Wung! The sound rang out again, causing Shea's heart to jump. However, this time, the silver light was not aimed at him. Instead, he watched as the head of the sacrificer that Sharba was holding onto was shattered by the silver light. The silver light not only shattered the sacrificer's head, it also blasted Sharba's shoulder into a mess of flesh and blood. No matter how tough Sharba was, he was unable to withstand such a heavy blow. With a grunt, he fell down. Shea rushed forward and grabbed Sharba and carried him on his back. Then, he turned around and ran toward the entrance of the valley. However, He was running with all his might. With a single leap, he covered several meters. With the death of the sacrificer, the Odin warriors no longer had any fear. This was especially true for the beast soul warriors. With a roar, they charged forward. Ka-Tua had already reached the entrance of the valley. Seeing that Shea was still behind him, he was about to turn around and help when Shea shouted, "Don't wait for me! Run! Damn it, run!" At this moment, the third sound of the bowstring rang out. One. The sound came from afar. Shea steeled himself. With Sharba on his back, he could not let this fellow be shot to death. Shea gritted his teeth and turned around. Puffing out his chest, he faced the incoming silver light and brandished his flaming fork again. However, he was still injured. This time, the flaming fork was unable to block the silver light. With a bang, the silver light struck Shea's chest. The surface layer of his leather robe was instantly reduced to powder by the silver light. Following that, the armor underneath was also instantly shattered. A clear cracking sound rang out. This sound caused Shea's heart to be filled with despair. The dragon's scales had been pierced. A cold air pierced through the dragon's scales and pierced Shea's chest. With a boom, his vision turned black and he was sent flying backward. This time, he was sent flying for over 10 meters. While he was in the air, he spat out a mouthful of black blood. The blood that he spat out instantly froze into ice. When Shea hit the ground, Sharba, who was behind him, cried out in pain. Several of his bones were broken. The dragon's scale on Shea's chest had also been split in half. The wound on Shea's chest was so deep that his bones could be seen. However, the wound had already frozen into ice crystals. Even the blood did not flow out. Instead, it had all turned into a layer of blood-red frost. Shea spat out a mouthful of black blood. However, his mind became clear in an instant. He saw the Odin's people rushing towards him from afar. At this moment, he had already landed at the entrance of the valley. Ka-Tua, who was beside him, grabbed Shea's arm and pulled him up with all his might. Then, the three of them staggered out of the valley. Cuchulain's face was so calm that it was somewhat strange. He watched as Shea rushed out of the valley. His fingers were originally on the bowstring. However, at the last moment, a strange look flashed through his eyes. He finally let go of his fingers and turned around to place the strange big bow on the bone seat. This feminine Odin's noble face blossomed into a strange smile. And, after being shot in the chest by my arrow, he can still run. This fellow is very interesting. He immediately raised his head and coldly said to the people beside him, "Pass down the order. There is no need to chase him out of the valley." After saying that, Cuchulain ignored the strange expressions of his subordinates and sat down on the bone seat. He placed one hand on the armrest and gently touched his forehead. Then, he closed his eyes and pondered for a moment. To be able to block 2 of my arrows and not die, he can be considered a strong person. A strong person should not die in humiliation. A strong person should have a way of dying that matches his status. This fellow from Byzantium, I hope that I can personally kill you on the battlefield. Chapter 75. Kevin and Butler were already in a defensive formation at the south side of the valley, waiting for reinforcements. Suddenly, someone reported that someone had rushed out of the valley. Kevin immediately ran to the front and saw Shea and the other 2 running in from the outside of the valley. Behind them, Odin's people were chasing after them. Kevin did not hesitate and mounted his horse to meet them. Fortunately, the Odin's people did not chase after them. When they reached the entrance of the valley, they shouted for a while before retreating. Once Shea and the other 2 were rescued, they finally collapsed to the ground as if they had used up all their strength. They were carried back by the Byzantium cavalry. Arriving in the ranks of his own people, Shea suddenly laughed wildly. The fear and nervousness in his heart, as well as the pressure of surviving a calamity, were all vented out, turning into wild laughter. He laughed so hard that he swayed back and forth. Although the wounds on his body were touched, he couldn't care less. However, his laughter was mixed with cries of pain, which was a bit strange. Ha 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 ha. Lao Tzu actually did not die. Lao Tzu actually survived. Ha 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 ha. Ka-Tuo and Sharbo were also bandaged. Ka-Tuo's injuries were not bad, but Sharbo was miserable. Cuchulain's last arrow had sent Shea flying. When he landed on the ground, Sharbo was underneath him and broke a few bones. Fortunately, the broken bones did not pierce into his internal organs. Otherwise, without a priest present, he would have died. Kevin and Butler surrounded Shea and the other two, and asked carefully. When they heard that Shea had escaped alone, he muddle-headedly snuck into the forest beside the valley and met the Odin's shaman. What? Bartley suddenly shouted, Tell me, you killed a shaman? A Odin's shaman? The man's depressed expression was swept away and his face was filled with excitement. Kevin also widened his eyes and stared at Shea. His mouth was wide open, but he could not say a word. To be precise, I didn't kill them. They were shot to death by their own people. He probably saw that he couldn't save him, so he decided to. Shea sounded uncertain. No matter what, you've captured the priestess. There's nothing wrong with that. Kevin suddenly punched Shea in the chest, causing Shea to scream in pain. He coughed and spat out a few more mouthfuls of blood. Kevin quickly retracted his hand and looked at Shea nervously. Baldy, are you trying to kill me? Shea groaned. He could feel that the injury he had sustained this time was the most serious one he had ever sustained. Kevin rubbed his bald head embarrassedly. Sharba and Ka-Tuo said weakly, It was Shea who caught the sacrificer. He just saved us. We will never compete with Shea for this credit. Haha. Kevin was agitated as he stared at Shea. You idiot, don't you know that every legion in Odin's army is equipped with a great shaman, and the status of a great shaman is almost the same as the appearance of the legion? From the way the high priest was dressed, he must not be an ordinary high priest. He must be the high priest of the legion. Shea, do you know how big of a credit it is to kill a high priest of Odin? How big of a credit? Shea opened his eyes wide. He was at a loss. He was not from Byzantium. How could he know the laws of Byzantium? Kevin swallowed his saliva and his face was flushed. This credit is enough for you to get a noble title and a fief. You will be a noble in the future. As for the title, it will be at least a jazz. If His Majesty is happy, he might make an exception and give you the title of Baron. Alas, I'm afraid it's impossible for it to be hereditary. It will most likely be a lifelong title. Jazz? Baron? How big can the fief be? Shea asked foolishly. Under normal circumstances, a jazz will be given a small piece of land, enough for you to build your own manor. As for a baron, you might be able to get a village as your fief. In your fief, you will have the right to enact laws and collect taxes. You can even have your own personal bodyguard, as long as you can afford it. A village, can it be as big as Wildfire Town? Shea's eyes shone. Wildfire Town is so big, not likely, Kevin shook his head. Wildfire Town can be considered a small city. A normal village would be about a quarter of the size of Wildfire Town. Damn it! Shea suddenly sat up in excitement. Although his face was distorted from the pain, he could not help but shout out. A quarter of the size of a black street. Ah! Wouldn't that make me someone like the mayor? I can make the decisions in my fief? Ha ha! Wouldn't that mean I can do whatever I want? Whatever I like, I can bring it home. Whichever girl I like, I can snatch her home. Ha ha! Kevin, Sharba and Ka-Tuo's faces froze. This rookie, this country bumpkin. They thought he was a good person. If he were to become a noble, he would definitely be a bully like a tyrant. Looking at this country bumpkin's wild laughter, Ka-Toa suddenly blinked. There is one more thing. When we were captured, those Odin's men interrogated us and described a person to us. The person they described, the weapon he used was the black fork that this kid likes to use. His appearance and attire were also from this kid. On the hillside where we were ambushed, he killed many archers. I heard that the leader of the Odin's reindeer cavalry was also killed. Shea froze for a moment and then nodded. At that time, I did cut down many. Kara took a deep breath and asked, Did you split someone in half with a single strike? And it was cut in half at the waist? Yes, that's right. Ka-Toa smiled slyly. In the future, it seems that we are destined to call this guy a noble. This time, he will at least be a baron, and it will be hereditary. Looking at Kevin and Sharba's puzzled expressions, Ka-Toa smiled bitterly. I know a bit of Odin's language. I heard from those Odin's men that Shea killed that Odin's reindeer cavalry. There was a highness. Highness? This time, Kevin and Sharba were completely shocked. After a long time, Butler's voice was hoarse as he stared at Shea. A high priest and a highness. Damn it. You brat, this time, even if you don't want to be a noble, you won't be able to. Saying this, Sharba grabbed Shea and laughed. You're rich. Spit out the money you won from me in the bet. Ha 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 ha. Shea was stunned by this sudden happiness. Noble? Baron? Hereditary? The happy country bumpkin began to look forward to the wonderful life of a landlord and a tyrant. When it was almost afternoon, General Adric arrived with the first emblem group. With the arrival of the first emblem group's mounted infantry, Butler's and Kevin's remaining troops received strong support. Everyone's confidence was instantly boosted. The first emblem group was mounted infantry. Very quickly, they set up a camp in the south of the valley. The camp was set up in the middle of the flat terrain. The military supplies that came along with the army were set up as fortifications, and tall wooden planks were used as fences. Shea, Ka-Toa, and Sharba were recuperating in the tent. He was severely injured this time. The last arrow contained a strong freezing power that almost froze his wounds and blood. When he was treating his wounds, he realized that his wounds were instantly frostbitten. Moreover, his lungs suffered some internal injuries. When he coughed, he couldn't breathe smoothly. When he coughed, there was some blood foam. With this injury, even though his body was strong, it would still take a few days for him to recover. While he was chatting with Sharba, Kevin came in with 2 bodyguards. Kevin's expression was very serious. The general wants to see you. Oh? Is it about the reward? Shea was instantly overjoyed. Idiot, the reward has to wait until after the war. Kevin didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The general has something to ask you. The 2 bodyguards directly carried Shea's bed to General Adric's temporary tent. The scarred general carefully looked at Shea a few times before smiling. Well done, kid. After saying that, he walked to Shea's side and checked his injuries. The general stared at the country bumpkin. Are you afraid? Shea scratched his head. I was very afraid at that time. But when it came to the real fight, I forgot to be afraid. Adric was stunned for a moment. Then, he laughed loudly. Good kid. So many people pretended to be heroes in front of me. Only you would tell the truth. You said that you were afraid. That's right. Who isn't afraid of death? If you can live, who wants to die? But, there are many times when people are forced to move forward step by step. Who isn't afraid of death? Humph, you are very good. Very honest. Shea was speechless. Using the word honest to describe himself, he was afraid that the general had really misjudged him. Todoro's resentment, Adric revealed a faint smile and a glint flashed across his eyes. Your contribution will be discussed after the war. After saying that, he pulled out the dagger that he often fiddled with from his boots, and placed it in Shea's hand. This is for you. The dagger was the general's favorite item. Shea held it in his hand and examined it. The dagger's blade glowed with a cold light. It was indeed a rare weapon. Naturally, the thing that made this country bumpkin happy was that the hilt of the dagger was made of pure gold. Just as General Audiobook was playing with his dagger with a grin on his face, his expression turned serious. "You fought with those archers on the way here. Tell me what they look like, their equipment and their combat power." Shea was stunned. Then, he suddenly had an idea. "General, you mean, humph." A trace of viciousness flashed across Adrik's eyes. "Since when did Odin's men have such elite archers? Those archers who stopped you are definitely not Odin's men." "Not Odin's men, elite archers. Could it be those from the sea?" Shea blurted out. "You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.